The sound of my mother's voice on the phone with my ex-husband made my blood run cold. I stood frozen outside the kitchen door, listening to the woman who raised me betray every confidence I'd ever shared with her. "She's hiding money somewhere, Kevin," Patricia Brooks whispered urgently into the receiver. "I know my daughter. She's been acting strange lately, buying expensive coffee and those fancy skincare products. There has to be assets she's not declaring in the divorce papers." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My heart shattered as I heard her continue feeding information to the man who had cheated on me with his secretary, the same man who was now trying to take half of everything I owned in our upcoming divorce proceedings. What my mother didn't know, what nobody knew except my business partner Marcus, was that her daughter wasn't just hiding a few $1,000s in a secret account. I was the silent founder of one of the fastest-growing app development companies in the Southwest, with a real estate portfolio worth more than our entire neighborhood combined. But as I stood there listening to my own mother plot against me, I realized that sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones who are supposed to love you unconditionally. And sometimes, the best revenge isn't just proving them wrong, it's showing them exactly who you really are. My name is Natalie Brooks, and 6 months ago I thought I had everything figured out. I was married to Kevin Martinez, a real estate agent who seemed charming and ambitious when we met at Arizona State University 5 years earlier. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom house in a middle-class Phoenix neighborhood, drove reliable used cars, and spent our weekends hiking in the desert or having barbecues with family. To everyone around us, we looked like the perfect young couple building their American dream together. What they didn't see were the late nights Kevin spent showing properties that turned out to be hotel rooms with his 22-year-old assistant Victoria Sterling. They didn't witness the gradual erosion of respect, the way he started dismissing my opinions about everything from dinner plans to major life decisions. Most importantly, they had no idea that while Kevin was struggling to close deals and blaming the market for his failures, I was quietly building something extraordinary. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in March. Kevin had left early for what he claimed was a breakfast meeting with potential clients, but I'd learned to recognize the difference between his work clothes and his cheating clothes. The cologne was always a dead giveaway. I was sitting at our kitchen table, laptop open, reviewing quarterly reports from TechFlow Solutions, the app development company I'd co-founded 3 years earlier, under a carefully constructed business identity that kept my involvement completely hidden from Kevin and my family. Our latest project, a supply chain management app for small businesses, had just secured a $2 million contract with a major retail chain. The success felt bittersweet, knowing that my marriage was crumbling while my professional life was reaching heights I'd never imagined possible. I had built this empire in secret, working from our spare bedroom while Kevin slept, taking meetings during my lunch breaks from my day job at a local marketing firm, all while maintaining the facade of being just another struggling millennial trying to make ends meet. The decision to keep my business ventures secret hadn't been about deception initially. When Marcus Chen and I first started TechFlow, it was just a side project, something we worked on during evenings and weekends to supplement our regular incomes. Marcus handled the technical development while I managed client relationships and business strategy. We were careful to keep our names off public records, operating through a complex but legal structure of LLCs and business partnerships that protected our privacy and intellectual property. But as the company grew and the money started flowing in, I realized that keeping my success hidden had become a form of protection. I watched how Kevin reacted when other people in our social circle achieved milestones, the resentment that would flash across his face when his college friends got promotions or bought new houses. I saw how he diminished my small victories, like when I received recognition at my marketing job or when I suggested investment strategies for our modest savings. He had a way of making me feel like my contributions were insignificant, like his struggles in real estate were somehow more valid than any success I might achieve. So I kept building, kept growing, kept investing. Every contract TechFlow secured went into carefully managed accounts that Kevin knew nothing about. Every real estate investment I made through the company was handled by lawyers and accountants who specialized in privacy protection. Within 2 years, I owned a portfolio of rental properties across Arizona, including a stunning ranch-style estate in Sedona that I'd purchased as both an investment and a retreat, somewhere I could go to think and plan when the walls of my marriage felt too confining. The irony wasn't lost on me that Kevin, a real estate agent, had no idea his wife owned more property than most of his clients. But that Tuesday morning, as I sat reviewing reports that showed my net worth had crossed into eight-figure territory, I knew the charade was coming to an end. The previous weekend, I'd finally gathered enough evidence of Kevin's affairs to feel confident about filing for divorce. Screenshots of text messages, credit card statements showing charges at restaurants and hotels I'd never been to, even a private investigator's report that documented his patterns of deception with clinical precision. What I wasn't prepared for was my mother's reaction when I finally told her the truth about my marriage. Patricia Brooks had always been the kind of mother who believed that family loyalty trumped everything else. She'd raised my brother Daniel and me with old-fashioned values about commitment, sacrifice, and making relationships work no matter what obstacles arose. When I called her that Tuesday afternoon to ask if we could meet for coffee, I expected her to be supportive, maybe angry on my behalf, certainly devastated that her daughter's marriage was ending. Instead, when I sat across from her at our usual spot, a small cafe near her house in Tempe, and explained that Kevin had been cheating, and that I was planning to file for divorce, her first response was to lecture me about forgiveness. "Natalie, honey," she said, stirring her coffee with the mechanical precision she applied to everything in her life, "marriage isn't easy. Your father and I went through rough patches too, but we worked through them. Kevin's a good man who's just struggling with his career right now. Maybe if you were more supportive, more understanding of the pressure he's under." The victim blaming stung, but what came next was even worse. Over the following weeks, as I began the process of separating my life from Kevin's, I discovered that my mother had become his confidant. She was taking his phone calls, listening to his version of events, and somehow becoming convinced that I was the problem in our marriage. According to Kevin's carefully crafted narrative, I was cold, unsupportive, and unreasonable in my expectations. He painted himself as a hardworking man, whose wife didn't appreciate his efforts, whose career setbacks were somehow my fault because I wasn't encouraging enough. My mother, who had spent 32 years watching me navigate life's challenges with determination and integrity, suddenly seemed to believe that I was capable of destroying my marriage out of selfishness. She started suggesting couples counseling, recommending that I give Kevin another chance, and most painfully implying that perhaps I was being too harsh in my judgment of his mistakes. The breaking point came 3 weeks later, when I hired divorce attorney Margaret Foster, one of Phoenix's most respected family law practitioners. Margaret was known for her thoroughness and her ability to protect her clients' interests, especially in cases involving complex asset division. During our initial consultation, I explained that while Kevin knew about our joint bank accounts, our house, and our cars, he was unaware of my business interests and separate property holdings. "We need to be strategic about disclosure," Margaret advised. "Arizona is a community property state, but assets acquired before marriage, or through separate business endeavors can be protected if we document everything properly. The key is being transparent with the court, while ensuring your husband's legal team doesn't get information they're not entitled to during the discovery process." I followed her advice precisely, providing complete financial disclosure to the court while keeping Kevin's lawyers focused on the assets he knew about. It was completely legal and exactly what any competent attorney would recommend for a client with complex holdings. But somehow Kevin had gotten the idea that I was hiding money, and he was determined to find it. That's when he enlisted my mother as his spy. The first sign that something was wrong came when my mother started asking unusually specific questions about my finances during our weekly phone calls. "Natalie, sweetie, how are you managing money-wise with the divorce costs? Are you having to dip into savings? I hope you're not putting everything on credit cards." The questions felt intrusive, but I attributed them to maternal concern about my well-being during a difficult time. Then she began making observations about small changes in my lifestyle. "I noticed you've been shopping at Whole Foods instead of Safeway lately. And that new moisturizer you're using looks expensive. Are you sure you should be spending money on luxury items right now when you're paying legal fees?" Each comment felt like an interrogation disguised as concern, but I told myself I was being paranoid. The truth became clear the evening I decided to surprise her with dinner. I'd been feeling guilty about how distant I'd become during the divorce proceedings, and I wanted to reconnect with the woman who had always been my strongest supporter. I stopped by the grocery store to pick up ingredients for her favorite meal, chicken enchiladas with homemade salsa, and drove to her house unannounced. That's when I heard her on the phone with Kevin, systematically reporting my activities and expenditures like she was building a case against her own daughter. The betrayal cut deeper than Kevin's infidelity ever had, because this was my mother, the person who was supposed to protect me unconditionally, actively working to undermine my legal position in the divorce. But as I stood there listening to her cataloging my recent purchases and speculating about hidden assets, I realized that Patricia Brooks was about to learn something about her daughter that would change everything between us forever. Because in 3 days, TechFlow Solutions was scheduled to announce our acquisition by a major tech corporation, a deal that would make my ownership stake a matter of public record, and transform me from a struggling divorcee into one of Arizona's most successful young entrepreneurs. The irony was exquisite. My mother was helping Kevin search for hidden money that didn't exist in the form he imagined, while completely unaware that her daughter's actual wealth would soon be splashed across business journals and tech blogs throughout the region. Kevin had convinced her that I was deceiving everyone about a few $1,000s in secret accounts, but the reality was that I'd built an empire worth millions while living in their modest world of middle-class assumptions. As I quietly backed away from the kitchen door and let myself out of my mother's house, I felt something shift inside me.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The hurt and betrayal were still there, but they were being joined by something else. In 72 hours, everything would change. Kevin would discover exactly what kind of woman he'd cheated on and lost. My mother would understand the magnitude of her mistake in choosing his lies over her daughter's integrity. But most importantly, I would finally be free to live as the successful, independent woman I'd worked so hard to become, without hiding my achievements or diminishing my worth to make other people comfortable with their own limitations. The game was about to change, and for the first time in months, I was looking forward to tomorrow. The pattern emerges the following morning, brought a text message from Kevin that made my stomach turn. Your mom thinks you might be hiding assets. Just want you to know I'm not trying to be vindictive, but my lawyer says I have every right to request a full financial investigation. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Nat, the casual threat, combined with the use of my nickname like we were still intimate, felt like a slap across the face. But what truly devastated me was knowing that my mother had given him the ammunition for this attack. Patricia Brooks, who had taught me about honesty and integrity since childhood, was now helping my cheating ex-husband build a case to destroy me financially. I forwarded the message to Margaret Foster, who responded within minutes. Document everything, save all communications. This kind of phishing expedition usually backfires on the person making threats, especially when they can't produce evidence of actual hidden assets. Stay calm and let me handle the legal response. But staying calm felt impossible when my entire support system was crumbling around me. That afternoon, I decided to visit my brother Daniel at his auto repair shop in Mesa, hoping to find someone in my family who hadn't been poisoned against me. Daniel was 3 years younger than me, and we'd always been close despite our different paths in life. While I'd pursued business and technology, he'd found his passion working with his hands, building a successful automotive business that specialized in classic car restoration. I found him under the hood of a 1967 Mustang, his face streaked with grease but his eyes lighting up when he saw me approach. "Hey stranger," he said, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Haven't seen you around much lately. How are you holding up with everything?" The genuine concern in his voice almost brought me to tears. "Not great, honestly," I admitted, sitting on a nearby workbench. "Kevin's threatening to drag me through a financial investigation, and Mom seems to think I'm some kind of criminal mastermind hiding money from him." Daniel's expression darkened. "Yeah, she mentioned something about that when I had dinner with her last week. Said Kevin was worried you might be keeping secrets about finances." He paused, studying my face carefully. "Are you?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications. Daniel knew me better than almost anyone, and I could see him trying to reconcile the sister he'd grown up with against the possibility that I might be capable of deception. The fact that he even had to ask felt like another betrayal, but I understood why he was confused. Our mother's influence was powerful, and she'd apparently been building a case against me with the rest of our family. "I'm not hiding anything illegal," I said carefully, "but there are things about my life that Kevin doesn't know, things I've been working on independently." I took a deep breath, looking around the shop where Daniel had built his dreams through sheer determination and skill. "Can I trust you to keep a secret? Something that's going to become public knowledge very soon anyway." He nodded, his expression serious. You know you can. So I told him everything. About Tech Flow Solutions, about Marcus Chen, about the years of late nights and careful planning that had built something extraordinary. While everyone around me assumed I was just another struggling wife supporting her husband's career, I explained about the real estate investments, the legal structures that protected my business interests, and the acquisition announcement that was coming in less than 48 hours. Daniel listened without interruption, his eyes growing wider as the scope of my success became clear. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, processing everything I'd revealed. Finally, he shook his head in amazement. Jesus, Nat, you built all of that while living with Kevin. How did he not notice? Because he never paid attention to what I was actually doing, I replied. He saw me on my laptop and assumed I was shopping or browsing social media. When I took evening meetings, I told him they were book club or yoga class. He was so focused on his own struggles that he never bothered to ask detailed questions about my life. And Mom has no idea. None. She thinks I'm barely scraping by, which is why Kevin's story about hidden assets sounds plausible to her. She's imagining maybe $10,000 or $20,000 in a secret account, not a business empire. Daniel ran his hands through his hair, still processing the magnitude of what I'd shared. This is going to blow up spectacularly when it comes out. That's what I'm counting on, I admitted. Kevin's about to discover that the woman he cheated on and tried to manipulate is worth more than he'll ever see in his lifetime. And Mom is going to have to face the fact that she chose to believe his lies over her own daughter's character. But even as I spoke those words, the pain of my mother's betrayal continued to eat at me. Patricia Brooks hadn't always been the woman who was currently conspiring with my ex-husband. Growing up, she'd been my fiercest advocate, the mother who drove me to debate tournaments and science fairs, who celebrated my academic achievements and encouraged my ambitions. She'd worked double shifts at the hospital where she was employed as a nurse to help pay for my college education, sacrificing her own comfort to ensure I had opportunities she'd never had. That version of my mother would have been proud of what I'd accomplished with TechFlow. She would have marveled at my business acumen and celebrated my success, even if she didn't fully understand the technology behind it. But somewhere along the way, that supportive mother had been replaced by someone who seemed more invested in maintaining the appearance of family harmony than in defending her daughter's integrity. The transformation had been gradual, starting around the time I'd gotten engaged to Kevin. Patricia had been so thrilled that I was settling down with what she considered a nice, stable man, that she'd overlooked red flags that should have been obvious. When Kevin made dismissive comments about my career ambitions during family dinners, she'd laughed them off as harmless teasing. When he failed to show up for important events, because of work commitments that later proved to be fabricated, she'd made excuses for him about the pressures of building a business. Over the years, my mother had become increasingly invested in the narrative that Kevin was a hard-working man struggling against difficult circumstances, while I was the privileged wife who didn't fully appreciate his efforts. She'd bought into his version of our relationship so completely that when the marriage started falling apart, she automatically assumed I was the problem. The irony was devastating. Patricia Brooks had raised a daughter who'd exceeded every expectation she'd ever set, who'd built something remarkable through intelligence and determination, who'd navigated complex business relationships and financial strategies with expertise that would impress seasoned entrepreneurs. But instead of recognizing those achievements, she was helping my ex-husband search for evidence of wrongdoing that didn't exist. That evening, I received a call from Marcus Chen with an update that made the timing of everything feel almost cosmically orchestrated. The acquisition paperwork is finalized, he said, his voice barely containing his excitement. The announcement goes out tomorrow morning, and the business journals want to do interviews by Friday. Are you ready for this? As ready as I'll ever be, I replied, looking around the modest house that Kevin and I had shared, knowing that within 24 hours, everything about my public identity would change forever. You know this is going to make national news, right? Marcus continued. Two 30-something entrepreneurs building a multi-million-dollar company in their spare time, then selling it to a Fortune 500 corporation. The business press is going to eat this story up, especially when they find out you did it all while keeping your day job and going through a divorce. The prospect of national media attention felt surreal, but also liberating. For 3 years, I'd been living a double life, hiding my achievements to protect my marriage and maintain family relationships. Tomorrow, that carefully constructed facade would disappear forever, and the world would see exactly who Natalie Brooks really was. But first, there was one more family dinner to endure. My mother had called earlier in the week to invite me to Sunday dinner, one of our long-standing traditions that had become increasingly uncomfortable as my marriage deteriorated. Usually, Kevin would accompany me, charming my parents with stories about his latest real estate deals, while I sat quietly beside him, playing the role of the supportive wife. This time, I'd be going alone, and I suspected my mother had ulterior motives for the invitation. She'd probably been conferring with Kevin about strategy, planning to use the family gathering to extract more information about my finances, or to stage some kind of intervention about my unreasonable expectations for marriage. The thought of sitting through another dinner, where my mother subtly interrogated me while serving the pot roast she'd been making every Sunday for as long as I could remember, felt almost unbearable. But I also knew it would likely be the last time I'd have to endure her misguided loyalty to Kevin, because in 18 hours, the business announcement would change everything between us forever. As I prepared for bed that night, I found myself thinking about the various ways my life could have unfolded differently. I could have been transparent about TechFlow from the beginning, sharing my success with Kevin and my family instead of hiding it. But I knew instinctively that approach would have destroyed everything I'd built. Kevin's resentment and insecurity would have poisoned our marriage even faster, and his financial irresponsibility would have put my assets at risk. I could have ended my marriage years earlier, when the first signs of Kevin's infidelity became apparent. But I'd been raised to believe that marriage required persistence and compromise, that walking away at the first sign of trouble was a character flaw rather than an act of self-preservation. My mother's influence had kept me trapped in a relationship that was slowly diminishing my sense of self-worth. Or I could have trusted my family with the truth about my business success, believing that their love for me would override any other considerations. But tonight's revelation about my mother's betrayal proved that assumption would have been catastrophically wrong. Patricia Brooks had chosen Kevin's narrative over her daughter's integrity, and there was no reason to believe she would have behaved differently if she'd known about TechFlow from the beginning. Instead, I'd followed my instincts, protecting my achievements and building something extraordinary, while navigating the complex dynamics of a failing marriage and unsupportive family relationships. Tomorrow would prove whether those instincts had been correct, but as I drifted off to sleep, I felt a sense of anticipation, rather than anxiety about what was coming. For the first time in years, I was about to stop hiding who I really was. And the people who had underestimated me, betrayed me, and tried to diminish my worth, were about to learn exactly what they'd lost. The hidden empire revealed. The announcement went live at 6 a.m. Pacific time, exactly as Marcus and I had planned. I was already awake, sitting in my home office with my laptop open, watching as the press release appeared on business news websites across the country. TechFlow Solutions, Phoenix-based app development company, acquired by enterprise software giant for $47 million. The headline felt surreal, seeing my company's name splashed across major business publications like Forbes, TechCrunch, and the Wall Street Journal. But what made it even more extraordinary was the accompanying photo that Marcus had insisted we include, both founders standing in front of our Scottsdale office building, finally ready to step out of the shadows and claim credit for what we'd built. My phone began buzzing within minutes. Text messages from college friends who'd seen the news, LinkedIn notifications from professional contacts, and interview requests from journalists who wanted to know more about the mysterious entrepreneurs behind TechFlow's success. But the call I was waiting for didn't come until almost 9 a.m. Natalie, Kevin's voice sounded strangled, like he was struggling to breathe properly. I just saw something online. There's a business article with your picture. It says you sold a company for $47 million. The disbelief in his tone was almost comical. Kevin Martinez, who'd spent 5 years convinced that his wife was just another middle management employee at a marketing firm, was trying to process the reality that she'd built and sold a multi-million-dollar business empire, while he slept in the next room. That's correct, I replied calmly, sipping my coffee while watching the social media metrics climb on our announcement posts. But how is that possible? You work at Anderson Marketing. You make $45,000 a year. We have joint bank accounts. I would have known if you were making that kind of money. The panic in his voice was becoming more pronounced as the implications settled in. Kevin was a real estate agent. He understood property values and asset division. If I'd built and sold a business worth tens of millions of dollars, the modest house and savings accounts he was fighting for in our divorce suddenly looked pathetic by comparison. I kept my business ventures separate from our marriage, I explained, enjoying the way each word seemed to hit him like a physical blow. TechFlow was founded and operated independently from our joint finances. The sale proceeds will remain my separate property under Arizona community property law. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. I could practically hear Kevin's mind racing, trying to calculate how much money he was losing by cheating on a woman he'd assumed was financially dependent on him. Finally, he found his voice again. Your mother said you were hiding assets. She was right. My mother was helping you search for evidence of maybe $20,000 in secret savings accounts. I corrected him. What I actually built was a legitimate business empire worth more than you'll earn in your entire lifetime. There's a significant difference between those two things. I need to call my lawyer, Kevin said, his voice now taking on the desperate edge of someone grasping for options that didn't exist. You should do that, I agreed. Ask him to explain Arizona's separate property laws, and how business assets acquired through independent ventures are protected from community property division. It might save you some time and legal fees. After Kevin hung up, I sat in my office savoring the moment of vindication. For 3 years, I'd endured his subtle put-downs about my career, his assumptions that his real estate work was more important than my little marketing job, his casual dismissal of my opinions about investments and financial planning. He'd cheated on me with a younger woman, partly because he'd convinced himself that he deserved better than his boring, unambitious wife. Now Kevin Martinez was discovering that the woman he'd betrayed and tried to manipulate in divorce proceedings was one of Arizona's most successful young entrepreneurs. The cognitive dissonance must have been overwhelming. But the call I was really anticipating came 2 hours later. My mother's number appeared on my phone screen, and I could imagine her sitting in her kitchen, staring at her iPad where she'd probably been reading about her daughter's business success with the same shock Kevin had experienced. Natalie, honey, Patricia's voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the underlying tremor. I just read the most interesting article online, about a company called TechFlow Solutions. There was a picture of you. Yes, that's my company, I said simply. Marcus Chen and I founded it 3 years ago. $47 million, my mother said slowly, like she was testing the words to see if they felt real. You sold a company for $47 million. Actually, my share was $28 million, I clarified. Marcus owns the larger stake since he handles the technical development side. But yes, it was a significant transaction. Another long pause. I could picture my mother processing this information, trying to reconcile the successful entrepreneur from the business articles with the financially struggling daughter she'd been discussing with Kevin just days earlier. Why didn't you tell me? She finally asked. The question hung between us, loaded with implications about trust, family loyalty, and the choices that had led us to this moment. I could have given her the easy answer, something about wanting to protect my privacy, or keeping business and family separate. But after everything that had happened, she deserved the truth. Because I knew you wouldn't be able to keep it secret from Kevin, I said quietly. And I was right. You've spent the last month feeding him information about my spending habits and speculating about hidden assets. If you'd known about TechFlow, you would have told him about that too. I was trying to help save your marriage. My mother protested. Kevin said you were being secretive and distant. He thought maybe if we could understand what was going on financially, we could work through the problems. Kevin was cheating on me with his assistant, I replied bluntly. He wasn't trying to save our marriage. He was trying to figure out how much money he could take from me in the divorce. And you were helping him do it. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my mother's breathing on the other end of the line, processing the full scope of her mistake. She'd been so invested in Kevin's version of events that she'd never questioned his motives or considered that her daughter might be telling the truth about his infidelity. Oh, Natalie, she whispered finally. I'm so sorry, I thought I was helping. Kevin seemed so sincere when he talked about wanting to fix things between you two. Kevin is a manipulative liar who convinced you to spy on your own daughter. I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded, despite the anger burning in my chest. While you were cataloging my grocery purchases and reporting them back to him, I was running board meetings for a multi-million-dollar company. While you were questioning whether I could afford expensive moisturizer, I was negotiating acquisition deals with Fortune 500 corporations. Each word felt like a small act of justice, finally revealing the magnitude of how wrong everyone had been about me. My mother had spent months treating me like an irresponsible child who needed guidance and supervision, never imagining that her daughter was operating at a level of business sophistication that exceeded anything in their family's experience. I don't understand how this is possible, she said, her voice small and confused. You never said anything about starting a business. You work at Anderson Marketing. I worked at Anderson Marketing as cover, I explained. It gave me credibility and steady income, while I built TechFlow. The real work happened during evenings and weekends, while Kevin was watching television or out with his girlfriend. The implications were staggering. Every family dinner where Kevin had dominated the conversation with stories about his real estate deals. I'd been quietly running a company that generated more revenue in a month than he earned in a year. Every time my mother had made suggestions about my career or finances, she'd been advising someone whose business acumen exceeded her own by orders of magnitude. The article says you specialize in supply chain management applications. My mother continued, clearly reading from her screen. It mentions contracts with major retail chains and manufacturing companies. How did you learn how to do all of this? The same way anyone learns anything, I replied. Research, practice, trial and error. Marcus handled the technical development, while I focused on client relationships and business strategy. We started small and grew organically, reinvesting profits and building our reputation in the industry. What I didn't mention was the countless nights I'd spent studying business development texts, the online courses I'd taken in financial management and contract negotiation, the industry conferences I'd attended using vacation days from Anderson Marketing. While Kevin was complaining about the challenges of his real estate career, I'd been systematically building expertise in multiple areas of business operations. I'm reading about your real estate investments too, my mother said, her voice becoming increasingly strained. It says you own multiple properties in Arizona, including something called a luxury ranch estate in Sedona. That's correct. Real estate was one of our first diversification strategies, as TechFlow became profitable. I've been building a portfolio for the past 2 years. The ranch in Sedona was my favorite acquisition, a sprawling property with panoramic views of the Red Rocks, and enough space to host corporate retreats or family gatherings. I'd bought it 6 months earlier, imagining it as a place where I could eventually bring the people I cared about for vacations and celebrations. Now it felt like a sanctuary, somewhere I could retreat when the relationships in my current life proved disappointing. Natalie, I don't know what to say, my mother admitted. I feel like I don't know you at all. You know me, I replied. You just never bothered to look past your assumptions about who I was supposed to be. You saw a marketing employee married to a real estate agent, and you decided that was the full extent of my identity. When Kevin started telling you stories about my behavior, you believed him because it fit your preconceptions better than considering that your daughter might be more capable than you'd imagined. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but I could tell my mother was struggling to process everything I'd revealed. The woman she'd been advising about finances and marriage was actually one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the state. The daughter she'd been worrying about was financially independent beyond anything their family had ever experienced. The secrecy she'd interpreted as deception was actually strategic privacy protection that had enabled extraordinary success. As we finally ended the call, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The vindication was everything I'd hoped for, but it came at the cost of relationships that had once meant everything to me. My mother's betrayal had been devastating, but her shock and remorse suggested that she was beginning to understand the magnitude of her mistake. The rest of the day brought a steady stream of interview requests, congratulatory messages, and social media mentions. Business journalists wanted to know about the challenges of building a tech company in Arizona. Industry analysts were interested in our acquisition strategy, and entrepreneurship publications wanted to feature our story as an example of successful side hustle development. But the most satisfying moment came that evening, when Daniel called with an update about the Family Gossip Network. You should have seen Mom's face when she called to tell me about the business article, he said, laughter evident in his voice. She kept reading sentences out loud like she couldn't believe they were real. Natalie Brooks, co-founder and chief strategy officer of TechFlow Solutions. I think she read that part 5 times. How is she handling it? She's devastated, Daniel admitted. Not about your success, obviously. She's proud of that, but she's horrified about how wrong she was about the Kevin situation. She spent an hour apologizing to me for doubting you, even though I wasn't the one she needed to apologize to. And Kevin, radio silence. But I heard through Victoria's sister that he's been calling divorce lawyers all day, trying to find someone who'll tell him he has rights to your business assets. Apparently he's not finding much encouragement. The image of Kevin frantically searching for legal loopholes that didn't exist felt like the perfect capstone to this phase of my vindication. He'd spent months strategizing about how to maximize his share of our modest joint assets, never imagining that his wife possessed wealth that would make their marital property look insignificant by comparison. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the media attention intensified and the reality of my changed circumstances settled in. But tonight, I sat in my home office surrounded by the trappings of my secret success, finally free to acknowledge what I'd accomplished and excited about the future I was building for myself. The game had changed completely, and for the first time in years, I was playing it on my own terms. The confrontation erupts. The media frenzy that followed our acquisition announcement exceeded even Marcus's predictions. By Wednesday morning, TechFlow Solutions was trending on LinkedIn. Our story had been picked up by 3 major business magazines, and my phone hadn't stopped ringing with interview requests from podcasters and industry publications. I was in the middle of a Forbes interview explaining our expansion strategy for the supply chain management sector when Margaret Foster's text message popped up on my computer screen. Emergency, Kevin's lawyer filed for immediate asset review. They're claiming fraud and demanding access to all your business records. Can you come in this afternoon? The irony was remarkable. Kevin had spent years dismissing my intelligence and ambitions, but now that he'd discovered my success, he was suddenly convinced I was sophisticated enough to orchestrate elaborate financial fraud. The man who'd never bothered to ask detailed questions about my work was now demanding forensic accounting of my business operations. I finished the Forbes interview, scheduled 3 more for the following week, and drove to Margaret's office in downtown Phoenix. The legal building was one of those glass towers that had always intimidated me during my Anderson marketing days, but now I walked through the lobby with the confidence of someone who belonged in environments where million-dollar decisions were made routinely. Margaret's office reflected her reputation as one of Arizona's top family law attorneys, leather-bound legal texts, diplomas from prestigious universities, and client photos featuring some of the state's most prominent business leaders. She gestured for me to sit across from her massive mahogany desk, then opened a file that was already several inches thick. Kevin's new legal team is more aggressive than his previous representation, she began without preamble. They're arguing that your failure to disclose TechFlow during the initial divorce filing constitutes intentional fraud designed to hide marital assets. They want a forensic accountant to review every transaction your company has made since your marriage began. Can they do that? I asked, though I was more curious than concerned. Marcus and I had been meticulous about legal compliance throughout TechFlow's development, precisely because we'd anticipated this kind of scrutiny eventually. They can try, Margaret replied with a slight smile. But Arizona law is very clear about separate property rights. Your business was founded and operated independently from your marriage, with separate funding sources and business structures. The timing of your disclosure doesn't change the fundamental legal protections. She pulled out a document that I recognized as Kevin's financial affidavit from his side of the divorce proceedings. What's interesting is that your husband claims to have no knowledge of your business activities, despite living in the same house for 3 years while you built a multi-million-dollar company. Either he's remarkably unobservant, or he's not being entirely truthful about his awareness. The second possibility hadn't occurred to me, but as Margaret spoke, I started remembering incidents that had seemed insignificant at the time. Late-night phone calls that Kevin had ended abruptly when I entered the room. Unexplained absences that he'd attributed to real estate showings. The way he'd sometimes seemed to know about my TechFlow meetings before I'd mentioned them. You think he knew about the company? I think he suspected you were involved in something lucrative, Margaret clarified. His new legal strategy suggests someone with more knowledge than he's admitting. The specific language about fraud and asset concealment implies coaching from someone familiar with complex business structures. The implications were staggering. If Kevin had known or suspected that I was building something valuable, his entire narrative about being a confused husband searching for hidden savings accounts fell apart. Instead, it suggested a calculated strategy to position himself as the innocent victim while planning to claim a share of assets he'd never contributed to. There's something else, Margaret continued, pulling out another document. Your mother-in-law Helen Martinez contacted my office this morning. She wants to provide testimony about your character and financial behavior during the marriage. Helen Martinez had always been kind to me, but she was fiercely protective of her son. If she was volunteering to testify in Kevin's favor, it meant the family was closing ranks around their version of events, regardless of the evidence. What kind of testimony? She claims you were secretive about money throughout the marriage, that you made large purchases without consulting Kevin, and that you deliberately prevented him from participating in financial decisions. She's essentially arguing that your business success proves you were capable of the deception he's alleging. The twisted logic was almost impressive in its circularity. My success was being used as evidence of my dishonesty, as if building a company while maintaining privacy about my business activities somehow proved criminal intent. Helen Martinez was turning my achievements into weapons against me, just like Kevin was doing. But Margaret's next revelation was even more disturbing. The most concerning development is that someone has been contacting your business associates, asking questions about TechFlow's founding and your role in the company. We think Kevin's team is trying to build a case that Marcus Chen was the real founder and that you've been exaggerating your contributions. The attack on my professional credibility felt like a violation beyond anything Kevin had done during our marriage. TechFlow wasn't just my business, it was my identity as an entrepreneur, my proof that I could build something extraordinary through intelligence and hard work. If Kevin's lawyers succeeded in diminishing my role in the company's success, they would be destroying the very foundation of my independence. How do we fight this? I asked. With documentation, Margaret replied, opening her laptop. We need every email, every contract signature, every board meeting minute that proves your integral role in TechFlow's development. We need client testimonials about your contributions, financial records showing your personal investment in the company, and timeline evidence demonstrating your involvement from the beginning. Over the next 3 hours, we built a comprehensive defense strategy that would demonstrate not only my legal right to TechFlow's assets, but also my fundamental role in creating the company's value. Margaret was thorough and methodical, anticipating every argument Kevin's team might raise and preparing counter-evidence for each scenario. But as we worked, I found myself thinking less about legal strategy and more about the personal dynamics that had brought us to this point. Kevin hadn't just cheated on me, he'd systematically underestimated my capabilities while secretly planning to profit from my success. My mother hadn't just chosen his side, she'd actively helped him gather information to use against me. Helen Martinez wasn't just supporting her son, she was trying to rewrite the story of my achievements to fit their narrative of victimhood. The pattern was becoming clear. Everyone in my life had been comfortable with me as long as I remained small, manageable, and predictable. The moment my success threatened their assumptions about who I was supposed to be, they turned against me with a viciousness that felt personal and calculated. By the time I left Margaret's office, the sun was setting over Phoenix, casting long shadows across the downtown skyline. I drove home through familiar neighborhoods, where I'd lived my hidden double life, thinking about how different everything looked now that the truth was finally exposed. My phone had been buzzing constantly with calls and messages, but when I finally checked it, one number stood out. Patricia Brooks had called 6 times in 2 hours. The voicemails progressed from concerned to frantic, my mother's voice becoming more strained with each message. Natalie, honey, please call me back. Kevin came by the house today with his lawyer. They're saying terrible things about you, about fraud and hidden money. I told them they were wrong, but they showed me documents. Please call me, I need to understand what's happening. The final message was barely a whisper. I think I made a terrible mistake, sweetheart. I'm so sorry, please come home so we can talk. But as I listened to my mother's voice breaking with remorse and confusion, I realized that home wasn't a place I could return to anymore. The relationships that had defined my life for 32 years had been fundamentally altered by the choices everyone had made during my divorce. Patricia Brooks could apologize for helping Kevin, but she couldn't undo the betrayal or erase the knowledge that she'd chosen his lies over her daughter's integrity. Instead of driving to my mother's house, I made a different choice. I called Marcus and asked him to meet me at our Scottsdale office, where we could work on preparing our defense materials in an environment that reflected who I'd become rather than who everyone expected me to be. The TechFlow building looked different in the evening light, its modern glass facade reflecting the city lights like a beacon of possibility. As I walked through the lobby that bore our company logo, I felt a sense of belonging that had been missing from every other aspect of my life. Marcus was already waiting in our conference room, surrounded by laptops and legal documents. I've been pulling together everything Margaret requested, he said without preamble. Client contracts, board resolutions, email chains, financial records. The evidence is overwhelming that you've been integral to every major decision we've made. Thank you, I said, settling into the chair where I'd made countless strategic decisions over the past 3 years. I know this isn't how you wanted to spend your evening. Are you kidding? Marcus replied with a grin. This is the most interesting legal drama I've ever been involved in. Your ex-husband is basically arguing that successful women don't exist, and your family is helping him do it. It's like watching someone try to prove that gravity doesn't apply to them. His perspective helped put the situation in context. Kevin wasn't just attacking my specific achievements, he was challenging the fundamental possibility that his quiet, unassuming wife could have built something extraordinary without his knowledge or involvement. The legal case was really about whether society would accept that women could be more capable and successful than their husbands assumed. We worked until almost midnight, organizing evidence and preparing testimony that would demonstrate my role in TechFlow's success beyond any reasonable doubt. But more importantly, the process reminded me why I'd built the company in the first place, not for revenge or vindication, but because I was capable of creating something valuable and wanted the independence that success would provide. As I finally drove home through the quiet Phoenix streets, I felt a sense of clarity about what was coming next. Kevin's legal challenge would fail because the evidence was overwhelming and the law was clear. My mother's remorse would eventually lead to reconciliation because our bond was stronger than her temporary lapse in judgment. The media attention would fade as other stories captured public interest, but the most important change was already complete. I was no longer hiding who I was or diminishing my achievements to make other people comfortable. Natalie Brooks, the successful entrepreneur and independent woman, was finally living openly and authentically. The confrontation phase was just beginning, but I was ready for whatever came next. The complete transformation 6 weeks after the acquisition announcement, I was sitting in a conference room at Margaret Foster's law firm, watching Kevin's attorney struggle to maintain his composure as his case disintegrated in real time. The forensic accounting review his team had demanded had backfired spectacularly, revealing not fraud or hidden assets, but a level of business sophistication and legal compliance that exceeded anything they'd anticipated. Mrs. Brooks, the opposing counsel said, shuffling through documents with barely concealed frustration, while we acknowledge that TechFlow Solutions appears to be legitimately your separate property. My client maintains that he was deliberately excluded from knowledge of these business activities during your marriage. Your client was excluded from business activities that didn't concern him, I replied calmly. TechFlow was founded and operated independently from our marriage, with separate funding sources and legal structures. Kevin had no involvement in the company's development and contributed nothing to its success. The statement hung in the air like a challenge. For 3 years, Kevin had dismissed my intelligence and ambitions, treating my career as a hobby that was less important than his real estate work. Now his lawyers were arguing that this same woman should have included him in building a multi-million-dollar business empire. Margaret had prepared me thoroughly for this deposition, but nothing could have prepared me for the satisfaction of watching Kevin's narrative collapse under the weight of actual evidence. The forensic accountant had traced every dollar TechFlow had earned, every investment decision I'd made, every contract I'd negotiated. The paper trail was immaculate, proving beyond doubt that I'd built something extraordinary through my own efforts. Let's discuss the timeline, Margaret interjected, opening a file that contained 3 years of documented evidence. Mrs. Brooks founded TechFlow Solutions in March 2021, using personal savings from her pre-marriage employment and a small business loan secured with her individual credit. The company's first client was secured in June 2021, with the initial contract signed exclusively by Mrs. Brooks as the company's founding partner and chief strategy officer. Mr. Martinez had no involvement in these business activities and received no financial benefit from the company's operations. Kevin shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face reddening as the timeline made clear that TechFlow had been generating substantial revenue while he was struggling to close basic real estate deals. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. While he'd been complaining about market conditions and blaming external factors for his professional setbacks, his wife had been systematically building one of Arizona's most successful tech startups. Furthermore, Margaret continued, Mrs. Brooks maintained complete separation between her business activities and the marital finances. TechFlow's banking accounts, business credit lines, and investment portfolios were established independently from any joint marital assets. The company's profits were reinvested in business growth and separate real estate investments that Mr. Martinez knew nothing about. The opposing attorney tried a different approach. Isn't it true that Mrs. Brooks used marital resources to support her business activities? Joint household expenses, shared internet service, the home office space, where she conducted company business. I almost laughed at the desperation in his voice. They were grasping for any connection between TechFlow and our marriage that might justify Kevin's claim to my assets. The home office was a spare bedroom that Kevin never used, I replied. I paid for upgraded internet service from my personal account, and TechFlow reimbursed me for any business-related expenses, according to standard corporate accounting practices. What about the time you spent building this company? The lawyer pressed, time that should have been devoted to your marriage and household responsibilities. The question revealed everything wrong with Kevin's worldview and the assumptions that had poisoned our relationship from the beginning. He'd never considered that his wife might be capable of excellence in her own right, that she might have ambitions beyond supporting his career and managing their domestic life. Even now, facing overwhelming evidence of my business success, his legal team was arguing that my achievements were somehow theft from our marriage. I built TechFlow during evenings and weekends, using time that was entirely my own, I said, maintaining the professional tone Margaret had coached me to use. Kevin spent those same hours watching television, playing video games, or pursuing extramarital relationships with his assistant. I chose to invest my free time in building a business. He chose different priorities. The reference to his infidelity made Kevin flinch visibly. Victoria Sterling had been a poorly kept secret that Kevin thought he'd hidden successfully, but private investigators and digital forensics had produced evidence that would make his adultery undeniable in court. While he'd been claiming that I was secretive and distant, he'd been conducting an affair that included romantic trips, expensive gifts, and promises about their future together once he'd cleaned up his divorce. Margaret shifted to a new line of questioning that would eliminate any remaining doubt about my business credentials. Mrs. Brooks, can you describe your role in securing TechFlow's largest client contracts? I personally negotiated our agreements with Pinnacle Manufacturing, Desert Logistics Network, and Southwest Retail Systems. I replied, citing contracts worth millions of dollars combined. These deals required extensive knowledge of supply chain management principles, software integration protocols, and enterprise-level service agreements. I spent months developing expertise in these areas and building relationships with decision-makers at each company. And what was your husband's involvement in these business development activities? None whatsoever. Kevin had no knowledge of these clients, no understanding of our technology offerings, and no participation in any aspect of our business operations. The admission hung in the room, like an indictment of everything Kevin had assumed about our relationship. For 3 years, he'd been living with a woman who was conducting high-level business negotiations, managing complex client relationships, and making strategic decisions that affected millions of dollars in revenue. While he'd been treating me like an underachieving wife who needed guidance about career and finances, I'd been operating at a level of professional sophistication that exceeded anything in his experience. Kevin's attorney made one final attempt to salvage his case. Here, Mrs. Brooks, didn't you have a moral obligation to share information about your business success with your husband? Isn't marriage supposed to be a partnership where major financial developments are discussed openly? The question struck at the heart of everything that had gone wrong between Kevin and me, and I took a moment to consider my response carefully. Margaret had advised me to keep my answers factual and unemotional, but this felt like the moment to explain the deeper truth about why I'd kept TechFlow secret. Marriage should be a partnership, I agreed. But Kevin never treated our relationship as an equal partnership. He dismissed my career ambitions, minimized my contributions to our household finances, and made unilateral decisions about major purchases and investments. When I tried to discuss business opportunities or financial strategies, he would change the subject or explain why my ideas wouldn't work. I learned to keep my professional life separate because Kevin had made it clear that he wasn't interested in my success unless it directly benefited him. The words felt like a release, finally articulating years of frustration about being underestimated and undervalued by the person who was supposed to be my closest ally. Kevin's face had gone pale as I spoke, perhaps recognizing the truth in my description of our relationship dynamics. Additionally, I continued, Kevin's current legal strategy proves that I was right to maintain privacy about my business activities. Rather than celebrating my success or acknowledging his mistakes, he's trying to claim ownership of achievements he contributed nothing to. This lawsuit demonstrates exactly why I couldn't trust him with information about TechFlow's development. Margaret smiled slightly, recognizing that I'd just provided the perfect closing argument for why Kevin deserved no consideration in the asset division. His own behavior during the divorce proceedings had validated every decision I'd made about keeping my business interests separate from our marriage. The deposition concluded with Kevin's legal team requesting additional time to review documents, but I could see in their faces that they knew the case was lost. Arizona's separate property laws were clear, the evidence of my independent business development was overwhelming, and Kevin's claims of ignorance about my activities looked increasingly implausible. As we left the law firm, Margaret was practically glowing with satisfaction. "That was one of the most decisive depositions I've ever participated in," she said. Kevin's team walked into this thinking they were dealing with a housewife hiding grocery money, and they discovered they were up against one of the state's most successful entrepreneurs. They're completely out of their depth. But my vindication in the legal proceedings was only part of a larger transformation that had been taking place since the acquisition announcement. The media attention surrounding TechFlow's sale had elevated my profile in Arizona's business community, leading to speaking opportunities, board appointments, and consulting offers that reflected my new status as a recognized industry expert. The Phoenix Business Journal had featured me on their cover as Entrepreneur of the Year, with an article that detailed my journey from marketing employee to tech company founder. Arizona State University's business school had invited me to give the keynote address at their annual entrepreneurship conference. 3 major corporations had approached me about serving on their advisory boards, recognizing that my experience building TechFlow could provide valuable insights for their own technology initiatives. Each recognition felt like validation of choices I'd made years earlier, when I'd decided to invest my time and energy in building something meaningful, rather than accepting the limitations other people had placed on my potential. The woman who had quietly served coffee while studying business principles had become someone whose opinions were sought by industry leaders and whose success story inspired other entrepreneurs. But the most significant change had been in my relationship with my family, particularly my mother. The shock of discovering my business success had forced Patricia Brooks to confront her own assumptions about her daughter's capabilities and the choices she'd made during my divorce proceedings. 2 weeks after the deposition, she'd asked me to meet her for lunch at a restaurant in Tempe, neutral territory, where we could have a conversation without the emotional weight of our family home. I'd arrived early and watched her walk across the parking lot, noticing how much older she looked than I remembered. The stress of realizing her mistake had taken a visible toll, and when she sat down across from me, her eyes were already red with unshed tears. "I owe you an apology that I can never fully make," she'd begun without preamble. "I betrayed my own daughter because I was too stubborn to see past my assumptions about your marriage and your life. I helped Kevin build a case against you when I should have been protecting you from his manipulation." The words were everything I'd wanted to hear, but they also highlighted the complexity of rebuilding trust that had been so fundamentally damaged. My mother's betrayal hadn't been a momentary lapse in judgment, it had been a systematic choice to believe Kevin's version of events over her own daughter's integrity. "I need to understand why," I'd replied. "You raised me to be independent and ambitious. You saw me excel in school, build my career, handle challenges with maturity and intelligence. When Kevin started telling you stories about my behavior, why did you believe him instead of trusting what you knew about my character?" Patricia had been quiet for a long time, staring at her hands while she considered the question. "Because it was easier," she'd finally admitted. "Kevin's story made sense with what I wanted to believe about marriage and family. If you were just being unreasonable or going through a difficult phase, then the problem could be fixed with better communication or more patience. But if Kevin was really the person you said he was, then I'd have to admit that I'd been wrong about him for years." The admission was painful but illuminating. My mother hadn't chosen Kevin's lies because she didn't trust me. She'd chosen them because accepting the truth would have required acknowledging that her judgment about people and relationships was fundamentally flawed. It was easier to believe that her daughter was being difficult than to face the reality that she'd been charmed by a manipulative man who was systematically deceiving everyone around him. "I also think," she'd continued more quietly, "that I was threatened by your success in ways I didn't want to admit. When I read about TechFlow and realized what you'd accomplished, part of me felt proud, but part of me felt diminished. You'd exceeded every expectation I'd ever had for you, and that made me question whether I'd ever really understood who you were." The honesty was devastating and liberating at the same time. Patricia Brooks was acknowledging that her betrayal hadn't just been about Kevin's manipulation, it had been about her own insecurities and limitations. She'd helped undermine her daughter partly because my success challenged her understanding of herself as the wise parent guiding her less experienced child. Over the following weeks, we'd begun the slow process of rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect, rather than traditional parent-child dynamics. My mother had started asking genuine questions about my business rather than offering unsolicited advice about my life choices. She'd begun treating me as the successful adult I'd become rather than the struggling daughter she'd imagined me to be. The change extended to our entire family system. Daniel had always been supportive, but now he talked to me differently, seeking my advice about expanding his automotive business and consulting me about investment strategies. Extended family members who had barely acknowledged my existence at previous gatherings were suddenly interested in my opinions about economic trends and business opportunities. Even more importantly, my mother had taken concrete steps to make amends for her role in Kevin's legal strategy. She'd provided a detailed affidavit to Margaret Foster describing every conversation she'd had with Kevin, every piece of information she'd shared with him, and every assumption she'd made that had led her to doubt my integrity. The document would be crucial if Kevin's team tried to claim that family members supported his version of events. But the most meaningful gesture had come when Patricia had called Kevin directly to withdraw her support for his legal case. I hadn't asked her to make that call, but she'd felt compelled to set the record straight about where she stood now that she understood the full truth about our marriage and divorce. I told him that I'd been wrong to help him, she'd reported to me afterward. I explained that learning about your business success had made me realize how much I'd underestimated you, and that I wouldn't be providing any more assistance with his lawsuit. He didn't take it well. Kevin's reaction had apparently been explosive, alternating between trying to convince her that I was manipulating the situation and demanding that she reconsider her position. When those approaches failed, he'd resorted to threats about how her withdrawal of support would affect his case and their future relationship. "What did you tell him?" I'd asked. "That my relationship with my daughter was more important than his feelings about losing a divorce case he should never have filed in the first place." Patricia had replied with a firmness that reminded me of the mother I'd grown up respecting. The conversation marked a turning point in our reconciliation. My mother wasn't just apologizing for her mistakes, she was actively working to repair the damage she'd caused and rebuild our relationship on stronger foundations. The process would take time, but for the first time since the divorce proceedings began, I felt hopeful about the possibility of restoring trust between us. Meanwhile, Kevin's legal case continued to deteriorate, as more evidence emerged about his knowledge of my business activities, and his deliberate attempts to manipulate the divorce proceedings. The private investigator Margaret had hired discovered that Kevin had been researching Arizona's community property laws months before I'd filed for divorce, suggesting that he'd been planning his strategy long before our marriage officially ended. Even more damaging was evidence that Kevin had been discussing my potential hidden assets with Victoria Sterling, plotting how they might use any money they could claim from the divorce to fund their new life together. Text messages between them revealed a level of calculation and greed that made his claims of being a confused husband look ridiculous. "Your ex-husband isn't just losing his legal case," Margaret had told me during our most recent meeting. "He's facing potential sanctions for filing frivolous claims and wasting court resources. Judges don't appreciate litigants who abuse the legal system to pursue groundless asset grabs." The prospect of Kevin facing professional consequences for his behavior felt like justice beyond anything I could have achieved through private revenge. He'd gambled that he could manipulate the legal system to claim ownership of my success, just as he'd gambled that he could manipulate our family relationships to support his version of events. Both strategies were failing spectacularly, leaving him worse off than if he'd simply accepted the original divorce terms. As autumn arrived in Phoenix, I found myself reflecting on how completely my life had transformed since that March morning, when I'd overheard my mother betraying my trust. The pain of that moment had been excruciating, but it had also catalyzed changes that had improved every aspect of my existence. I was no longer hiding my success or diminishing my achievements to make other people comfortable. TechFlow's acquisition had given me financial independence that eliminated any need to compromise my values for the sake of maintaining relationships. The media attention and industry recognition had established my reputation as a serious entrepreneur, whose opinions carried weight in business discussions. Most importantly, I'd learned to distinguish between people who celebrated my success and those who felt threatened by it. The relationships that had survived the revelation of my business empire were stronger because they were based on mutual respect and genuine appreciation for who I'd become. The relationships that hadn't survived probably weren't worth preserving anyway. The ranch in Sedona had become my sanctuary, a place where I could retreat for strategic planning and creative thinking without the distractions of Phoenix's business environment. I'd started hosting small gatherings there for other entrepreneurs and industry leaders, building a network of relationships that reflected my current reality rather than my previous limitations. But perhaps the most satisfying development had been watching Kevin's world contract as mine expanded. His real estate career continued to struggle, partly because potential clients were now aware of his reputation for dishonesty and manipulation. Victoria Sterling had ended their relationship once it became clear that Kevin wouldn't be receiving a windfall from our divorce, leaving him alone with the consequences of choices that had cost him everything valuable in his life. The contrast was stark and deliberate. While Kevin dealt with professional setbacks and personal isolation, I was building something extraordinary on the foundation of authenticity and hard work. While he faced potential legal sanctions for his frivolous lawsuit, I was being recognized as one of Arizona's most successful young entrepreneurs. The transformation was complete, but it was also just the beginning. TechFlow's acquisition had provided the resources and credibility to pursue even more ambitious projects, and I was already working with Marcus on our next venture. This time there would be no secrets, no hidden identities, and no apologies for success. Natalie Brooks, entrepreneur and independent woman, was ready for whatever came next. The new foundation, the final divorce decree, was signed on a crisp December morning in Phoenix, exactly 9 months after I'd overheard my mother's devastating phone call with Kevin. I sat in Margaret Foster's office, reviewing the document that officially ended my marriage, and confirmed what everyone now understood. Kevin Martinez would receive exactly what he'd contributed to our relationship, which amounted to his half of our modest joint savings account and his personal possessions. No share of TechFlow Solutions, no claim to my real estate portfolio. No access to the business empire I'd built while he slept in the next room, convinced that his wife was just another underachieving marketing employee who needed his guidance to navigate adult responsibilities. "How does it feel?" Margaret asked as I signed the final pages, her question carrying the weight of everything we'd accomplished together over the past year. Like freedom, I replied honestly. The legal battle had been exhausting, but it had also been transformative in ways I hadn't anticipated. Fighting for my right to keep what I'd earned had forced me to articulate my value, defend my achievements, and refuse to accept other people's limitations on my potential. Kevin had miscalculated catastrophically. His attempt to claim ownership of my success had backfired so spectacularly that he'd ended up with less than he would have received under the original divorce agreement. The frivolous lawsuit had cost him thousands in legal fees, damaged his professional reputation, and exposed his character flaws to everyone who had previously given him the benefit of the doubt. But more importantly, his strategy had inadvertently provided me with the platform to demonstrate exactly who I'd become. The media attention surrounding our legal battle had elevated my profile even further, leading to speaking engagements at major conferences and consulting opportunities with Fortune 500 companies. What Kevin had intended as an attack on my credibility had become a showcase for my business acumen and resilience. The irony was perfect and complete. Kevin had spent years undermining my confidence and dismissing my ambitions, convinced that keeping me small would ensure his dominance in our relationship. His final attempt to diminish me had instead provided the catalyst for me to claim my full power and step completely into the success I'd been hiding. As I left Margaret's office and walked through downtown Phoenix, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. A year ago, I'd been living a carefully compartmentalized life, successful in secret but diminished in public, building an empire while pretending to be someone much smaller than I really was. The woman who had served coffee while studying business principles seemed like a different person entirely, someone whose potential had been constrained by other people's expectations and her own fears about disrupting comfortable illusions. That afternoon, I drove to Sedona for what had become a monthly planning retreat at the ranch. The property had evolved into more than just a personal sanctuary. It was becoming the headquarters for my next venture, a business incubator focused on supporting other entrepreneurs who were building companies while navigating complex personal circumstances. The idea had emerged from conversations with other business owners who'd shared similar stories about hiding their success to protect relationships or avoid conflict. Apparently, my experience of building TechFlow in secret wasn't as unusual as I'd assumed. Many entrepreneurs, particularly women, found themselves managing the delicate balance between professional achievement and personal relationships that couldn't handle their success. Marcus was already at the ranch when I arrived, working on his laptop by the pool while taking advantage of the December sunshine that made Arizona winters feel like paradise. Our partnership had deepened throughout the legal battle, evolving from business collaboration into genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared values. "How did the decree signing go?" he asked, as I settled into the chair beside him. "Perfectly anticlimactic," I replied. "Kevin gets exactly what he deserves, which is nothing beyond his personal belongings and half of our checking account." The judge wasn't subtle about his opinion of frivolous litigation and waste of court resources. "Any word on the sanctions hearing?" Next month, Margaret thinks Kevin will face a substantial fine and possibly have his legal fees transferred to him personally rather than being covered by his attorney's malpractice insurance. The prospect of Kevin facing additional financial consequences for his failed legal strategy felt like justice, but I was more interested in discussing our plans for the future than rehashing his mistakes. The business incubator concept had been gaining momentum, with initial funding commitments from several Arizona-based venture capital firms and expressions of interest from entrepreneurs across the Southwest. I've been thinking about the selection criteria for our first cohort, Marcus said, opening a document on his laptop. We want people who are building legitimate businesses, but facing unique challenges that traditional incubators don't address. Complex family situations, divorce proceedings, partners who don't support their entrepreneurial goals. Basically people like us, I added, entrepreneurs who need more than just business mentorship because their personal circumstances are affecting their professional development. The parallel was obvious but important. TechFlow had succeeded partly because Marcus and I had been able to support each other through the challenges of building a business while managing relationships that didn't understand or appreciate our ambitions. Many entrepreneurs didn't have that kind of partnership, leaving them isolated and struggling to balance their professional goals with personal pressures. Our incubator would provide not just funding and business guidance, but also community and emotional support for people whose success was complicated by family dynamics, relationship challenges, or social expectations that conflicted with their entrepreneurial ambitions. I want to include coaching on personal boundaries and communication strategies. I continued. How to protect your business interests while maintaining important relationships. How to handle family members who feel threatened by your success. How to recognize when people in your life are undermining your confidence or trying to keep you small. The curriculum was essentially everything I'd wished I'd known 3 years earlier, when I'd been starting TechFlow while navigating a marriage that couldn't handle my ambitions. If other entrepreneurs could learn those lessons without going through the pain of betrayal and legal battles, the incubator would be providing value beyond traditional business education. We spent the afternoon developing detailed plans for what we were calling the Phoenix Rising Entrepreneurship Center, a name that reflected both our geographic location and the transformative nature of the program. The center would be housed at the Sedona Ranch, providing a retreat-like environment where entrepreneurs could focus on their business development without the distractions and pressures of their regular environments. But the most important conversation came that evening, as we sat by the fire pit watching the sun set over the red rocks. Marcus had been unusually quiet during dinner, and I could sense that he was processing something significant. I need to tell you something, he said finally. About the early days of TechFlow, and about Kevin. The statement sent a chill through me, partly because of Marcus's serious tone, and partly because I'd learned to be suspicious of revelations about my ex-husband. What about Kevin? He approached me about 6 months after we founded the company, Marcus admitted. He'd figured out that we were involved in something profitable, and he wanted to know details about the business structure and revenue projections. The revelation was stunning but not entirely surprising. I'd suspected that Kevin had known more about my activities than he'd admitted, but hearing confirmation that he'd actively tried to gather intelligence about TechFlow felt like another violation of trust. What did you tell him? Nothing, Marcus replied firmly. I told him that TechFlow's business activities were confidential and that he'd need to discuss any questions with you directly. But he kept pushing, asking about your ownership stake and whether the company was generating significant profits. Why didn't you tell me this before? Marcus was quiet for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the memory. Because you were already dealing with so many problems in your marriage, and I didn't want to add to your stress. I thought I could handle Kevin's inquiries without involving you, and I assumed he'd eventually give up when he realized I wouldn't provide information. The timeline was becoming clearer. Kevin's supposed ignorance about my business activities had been a calculated deception designed to support his legal strategy. He'd known that I was building something valuable, which explained his confidence in pursuing asset claims that would have seemed ridiculous if he'd genuinely believed I was just a struggling marketing employee. There's more, Marcus continued. Kevin also contacted 2 of our early clients, trying to gather information about your role in securing their contracts. He presented himself as your business partner and claimed he needed documentation for tax purposes. The audacity was breathtaking. Kevin had been conducting his own intelligence-gathering operation, trying to build a case for his involvement in TechFlow's success while publicly claiming ignorance about the company's existence. His entire legal strategy had been based on evidence he'd collected through deception and manipulation. Did the clients provide information? Not much. They were confused about who Kevin was and why he'd be involved in our business operations. But the fact that he tried suggests he was planning his divorce strategy much earlier than any of us realized. The implications were staggering. Kevin hadn't just been cheating on me with Victoria Sterling, he'd been systematically preparing to claim ownership of my business assets while conducting an affair that he planned to finance with money he'd steal from me through legal manipulation. "I should have told you immediately," Marcus said, his voice heavy with regret. "If you'd known about Kevin's inquiries, you might have been better prepared for his legal attack." "Actually," I said slowly, "I think your decision was right. If I'd known Kevin was investigating TechFlow, I would have confronted him, and that would have given him time to refine his strategy or find new ways to gather evidence. By keeping his activities secret, you forced him to build his case on incomplete information, which is why his legal arguments fell apart so quickly." The conversation continued late into the evening, with Marcus providing details about Kevin's attempts to infiltrate our business operations and my gradually understanding the full scope of my ex-husband's deception. But rather than feeling angry or betrayed, I found myself impressed by the irony of the situation. Kevin had been so convinced of his own cleverness that he'd undermined his own legal case. His attempts to gather intelligence about TechFlow had created a paper trail that proved he'd known about my business activities, destroying his claims of ignorance and marital exclusion. The evidence Marcus had preserved of Kevin's inquiries would have been devastating if the case had gone to trial. "You know what this means," I said as we finally prepared to head inside. "What?" Kevin defeated himself. His own arrogance and dishonesty provided the evidence that destroyed his legal strategy. He was so focused on trying to steal from me that he never considered how his behavior would look to a judge. The realization felt like the perfect conclusion to a year of vindication and transformation. Kevin Martinez had spent months plotting to claim ownership of my success, but his own character flaws had made his defeat inevitable. Meanwhile, I'd been building something even more extraordinary, a business empire that reflected my values, relationships based on mutual respect, and a future limited only by my own ambitions. As I settled into bed that night, listening to the desert silence that had become my soundtrack for strategic thinking, I felt a profound sense of completion. The woman who had discovered her mother's betrayal 9 months earlier had not just survived the experience, she'd used it as fuel for creating a life that exceeded every dream she'd ever allowed herself to imagine. The game had changed completely, and I'd won everything that mattered. The ripple effects spring brought news that felt like the final chapter in Kevin's long fall from grace. Victoria Sterling had not only ended their relationship but had also filed a harassment complaint with the Scottsdale Police Department after Kevin had become increasingly desperate in his attempts to win her back. Apparently, losing both his wife and his mistress in the same year had triggered a breakdown that included stalking behavior, threatening phone calls, and showing up uninvited at Victoria's new apartment complex. The irony was exquisite. Kevin had destroyed his marriage for a woman who'd only been interested in him when she thought he'd be coming into money from our divorce. Once Victoria realized that Kevin would be leaving our marriage with less than he'd entered it, she'd moved on to a pharmaceutical sales representative who actually had the financial prospects she was seeking. Meanwhile, the Phoenix Rising Entrepreneurship Center had officially opened with its first cohort of 12 entrepreneurs, each one bringing a unique story about building businesses while navigating challenging personal circumstances. The diversity was exactly what Marcus and I had hoped for, a single mother developing a food truck franchise while fighting her ex-husband for child support, a recent immigrant creating a technology consulting firm while his family pressured him to pursue traditional employment, a woman in her 50s launching a luxury event planning business while her adult children questioned her financial decisions. What united them all was the experience of having their entrepreneurial ambitions dismissed, undermined, or actively opposed by people who were supposed to support them. The stories shared during our weekly group sessions reminded me constantly of why the center was necessary, and why my own journey had been more common than exceptional. But the most unexpected development came from my relationship with my mother, which had evolved into something stronger and more authentic than anything we'd shared during my childhood. Patricia Brooks had not just apologized for her mistakes, she'd committed to understanding why she'd made them and ensuring they never happened again. She'd started attending family therapy sessions to explore her own patterns of thinking about success, gender roles, and parent-child relationships. The process had been revelatory for both of us, providing insights into dynamics that had shaped our family for generations. I realized that I'd been threatened by your success because it challenged everything I'd believed about women and achievement, she'd explained during one of our monthly dinner meetings. When I was your age, successful women were either unmarried or had to choose between family and career. Your ability to build something extraordinary while maintaining relationships, even difficult ones, forced me to question whether I'd limited myself unnecessarily. The admission had opened conversations about dreams my mother had abandoned, career opportunities she'd declined, and the ways that social expectations had shaped her choices throughout her adult life. Learning about her regrets and missed opportunities helped me understand why my success had initially felt threatening rather than inspiring to her. But more importantly, Patricia had become one of the center's most effective advocates, using her network of friends and professional contacts to identify potential entrepreneurs who might benefit from our program. Her transformation from someone who'd been threatened by my achievements to someone who actively promoted them felt like a miracle of personal growth and family healing. The center's success had also attracted attention from larger organizations interested in replicating our model in other regions. 3 major universities had reached out about partnership opportunities, and a national foundation focused on women's entrepreneurship had provided grant funding for expansion into New Mexico and Nevada. Each recognition felt validating, but the real satisfaction came from watching our entrepreneurs overcome obstacles and achieve milestones that had seemed impossible when they'd first arrived at the ranch. The single mother with the food truck franchise had secured her second location and was planning a third. The immigrant consultant had landed a contract with a Fortune 500 company that would triple his revenue. The woman launching the event planning business had organized a charity gala that raised over $100,000 for local nonprofits. Their successes reminded me constantly that my own story wasn't just about personal vindication, it was about demonstrating what became possible when people were given permission to pursue their full potential without apology or compromise. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Arizona State University's business school had created a scholarship in my name, specifically for students who were building businesses while managing complex family or relationship circumstances. The Natalie Brooks Entrepreneurship Scholarship would provide not just financial support but also mentorship and access to the Phoenix Rising program for students who needed more than traditional academic guidance. The announcement ceremony was held at the university's business building, in the same auditorium where I'd attended lectures about strategic planning and financial management while working at the coffee shop and dreaming about possibilities that had seemed impossibly distant. Standing at the podium where my professors had once taught me about entrepreneurship, I felt the full circle of transformation that had brought me to this moment. Success isn't just about building profitable businesses or accumulating wealth, I told the audience of students, faculty, and business leaders. It's about refusing to let other people's limitations become your own. It's about protecting your dreams even when the people closest to you don't understand them. And it's about using your achievements to create opportunities for others who are fighting the same battles you once faced. The speech had been covered by local media and shared widely on social media, generating interview requests and speaking opportunities that continued to expand my platform as an advocate for entrepreneurial independence. But the moment that had meant the most was seeing my mother in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughter receive recognition that exceeded anything either of us had ever imagined possible. After the ceremony, Patricia had approached me with a proposal that captured everything beautiful about our transformed relationship. I want to volunteer at the center, she'd said. Not in a leadership role, but helping with whatever needs to be done. Administrative work, hospitality for visiting entrepreneurs, whatever would be most useful. The offer was perfect because it was humble and genuine, reflecting her understanding that my success belonged to me and that her role was to support rather than direct my efforts. Over the following months, Patricia had become an invaluable part of the center's operations, bringing organizational skills and emotional intelligence that enhanced our ability to serve entrepreneurs facing complex challenges. Watching her interact with our program participants was particularly gratifying because it demonstrated how completely she'd internalized the lessons from her mistakes with Kevin. When entrepreneurs shared stories about family members who didn't support their ambitions, my mother listened with empathy and understanding rather than offering unsolicited advice. When they described relationship challenges that were affecting their business development, she provided perspective without judgment. Her transformation had become part of the center's informal curriculum, proof that people could change fundamental patterns of thinking when they were willing to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. The woman who had once helped my ex-husband search for evidence of financial deception had become one of the most effective advocates for entrepreneurial independence I'd ever encountered. But the most satisfying development had been watching Kevin's continued decline as my success reached new heights. His real estate career had never recovered from the reputation damage caused by our divorce proceedings, and his inability to secure quality listings or close deals had pushed him toward increasingly desperate marketing tactics. Daniel had reported seeing Kevin at local networking events, pitching himself as someone with connections to successful entrepreneurs and claiming inside knowledge about Arizona's tech industry. The presentations were apparently embarrassing displays of name-dropping and exaggeration that made other professionals uncomfortable. "He's basically trying to profit from his association with you," Daniel had told me during one of our regular coffee meetings. "But everyone knows about the divorce and the failed lawsuit, so his claims about business expertise just make him look pathetic." The image of Kevin attempting to leverage his connection to my success for professional credibility felt like poetic justice. The man who had spent years dismissing my ambitions was now trying to use my achievements to salvage his own failing career, but his reputation for dishonesty made even that desperate strategy ineffective. Meanwhile, TechFlow's acquirer had offered Marcus and me consulting contracts to help develop new products in the supply chain management space. The work was intellectually stimulating and financially lucrative, providing income streams that supported our other ventures while keeping us connected to the industry we'd helped shape. More importantly, the consulting work had introduced us to other entrepreneurs whose stories paralleled our own experiences. The business world was apparently full of people who'd built extraordinary companies while navigating relationship challenges, family opposition, or social expectations that conflicted with their professional ambitions. Those connections had inspired plans for expanding the Phoenix Rising model beyond Arizona, creating a network of entrepreneurship centers that specifically addressed the intersection of business development and personal relationships. The vision was ambitious but achievable, building on the credibility and resources that had emerged from my own journey. As I sat in my Sedona office 1 year after the divorce was finalized, I realized that Kevin's betrayal had been the catalyst for everything extraordinary that had followed. Without his attempt to steal my achievements, I might have continued hiding my success indefinitely, living small to accommodate relationships that couldn't handle my full potential. The phone call that would prove this point beyond doubt came on a Thursday afternoon in late April, just as I was reviewing applications for our second cohort of entrepreneurs. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice was unmistakably familiar despite its broken, desperate tone. "Natalie, please don't hang up," Kevin said, his words rushing together like he was afraid I'd end the call before he could speak. "I know I don't have any right to ask, but I need your help. I'm about to lose everything." The irony was staggering. The man who had spent months trying to claim ownership of my business empire was now calling to beg for assistance from the woman he'd betrayed and attempted to destroy financially. I could have hung up immediately, but curiosity about his desperation outweighed my distaste for conversation with him. "What do you want, Kevin? My real estate license is under review by the state board," he said, his voice cracking with stress. "There are complaints about misrepresentation and client fund mismanagement. If they revoke my license, I'll have no way to make a living. Victoria's threatening to testify against me unless I pay her back money she claims I borrowed. My credit cards are maxed out, and I'm behind on rent." The litany of problems was almost comical in its completeness. Kevin had managed to destroy every aspect of his life through dishonesty and poor judgment, creating a cascade of consequences that would have been impressive if it weren't so pathetic. "And you're calling me because you're the only person I know who has enough money to help me get back on my feet," he admitted, the words clearly painful to speak. "I know I made mistakes, but we were married for 5 years. That has to count for something." The audacity was breathtaking. Kevin was asking the woman he'd cheated on, lied about, and tried to rob through frivolous litigation to provide financial assistance for problems he'd created through his own misconduct. The cognitive dissonance required to make such a request suggested either complete desperation or fundamental disconnection from reality. "Kevin, you spent a year trying to prove that I was hiding money from you so you could claim half of everything I'd built. You hired lawyers to argue that my business success was somehow marital property that you deserved to share. Why would you think I'd give you money voluntarily when you failed to take it through legal manipulation?" "Because I know you're not a vindictive person," he replied, apparently still believing that he could manipulate my emotions despite everything that had happened between us. "You're successful now, more successful than either of us ever imagined. A few $1,000s wouldn't mean anything to your lifestyle, but it would save mine." The calculation in his appeal was obvious and insulting. Kevin was trying to leverage my financial success against my moral character, assuming that wealth had made me either guilty about my advantages or generous toward people who'd wronged me. He was betting that I'd pay him to go away, rather than endure the discomfort of refusing to help someone who was suffering, regardless of how he'd created his own problems. "You're right that a few $1,000s wouldn't significantly impact my finances," I said slowly, enjoying the hope I could hear building in his voice. "But you're wrong about my reasons for making financial decisions. I don't invest money in lost causes or reward people for treating me badly." "Natalie, please. I know I hurt you, but I'm desperate. My whole life is falling apart." "Your life is falling apart because of choices you made," I replied firmly. "You chose to cheat on your wife. You chose to lie about your business dealings. You chose to file a frivolous lawsuit trying to steal assets you hadn't earned. You chose to harass Victoria when she ended your relationship. Those weren't mistakes or accidents, Kevin. They were patterns of behavior that revealed your character." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for almost a minute before Kevin spoke again, his voice now carrying an edge of anger that suggested his desperation was being replaced by resentment. "You think you're so much better than everyone else now that you have money," he said, his carefully constructed humility dissolving into bitterness. "But you're still the same insecure girl who served coffee while pretending to understand business. You just got lucky with some tech company investment." The attempt to diminish my achievements felt familiar and predictable, Kevin's default response when manipulation failed. Even facing financial ruin and professional disgrace, he couldn't acknowledge that his ex-wife had succeeded through intelligence and hard work rather than luck or accident. "Kevin, I built TechFlow Solutions from nothing while you slept in the next room, convinced that your wife was too stupid and unambitious to achieve anything meaningful. I negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts while you struggled to sell suburban houses. I created jobs and economic value while you manipulated clients and mismanaged their funds. The difference between us isn't luck, it's character and competence." "Fine," he said, his voice now openly hostile. "Keep your money, but don't pretend you're some kind of saint. You lied to me for years about what you were doing. I protected my business interests from someone who's now proving that he would have tried to destroy them if he'd known they existed. I corrected. Everything that's happened since our divorce was finalized has validated every decision I made about keeping TechFlow separate from our marriage." Kevin hung up without another word, apparently realizing that his final manipulation attempt had failed, as completely as all his previous strategies. But rather than feeling satisfied by his defeat, I found myself thinking about the broader implications of our conversation. Kevin's call had crystallized something important about the transformation I'd undergone since discovering my mother's betrayal. The woman who had hidden her success to protect relationships was gone, replaced by someone who understood that authentic relationships could only exist when people were allowed to be fully themselves. The Kevin who had called begging for money was the same person who had dismissed my ambitions and cheated on our marriage, but he was also someone whose life had become a cautionary tale about the consequences of dishonesty and entitlement. His downfall wasn't something I had caused or orchestrated, it was the natural result of character flaws that had been evident throughout our relationship, but which I'd chosen to overlook or minimize. That evening, I shared the conversation with Marcus during our weekly planning meeting at the ranch. His reaction was immediate and unequivocal. "Please tell me you didn't give him money," he said, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Obviously not. But the call made me realize something important about why the Phoenix Rising Center matters so much." Marcus waited for me to continue, recognizing that I was processing something significant. "Kevin represents everything that happens when people refuse to take responsibility for their choices and their character," I said. "He spent years blaming external circumstances for his failures while undermining the people around him who were actually succeeding. Now he's facing the consequences of that approach, and his instinct is still to look for someone else to rescue him rather than examining his own behavior. And the entrepreneurs we work with are dealing with people like Kevin in their own lives," Marcus added, understanding where my thoughts were leading. "Exactly, family members who feel threatened by their success. Partners who try to claim credit for achievements they didn't contribute to. People who want to benefit from their hard work without supporting their efforts." The conversation continued late into the evening, but it reinforced my conviction that the center's mission extended far beyond business education. We were helping people recognize and resist manipulation, establish healthy boundaries, and build relationships based on mutual respect rather than emotional manipulation or financial dependence. Kevin's call had been his final attempt to maintain some connection to my success, but it had also provided perfect clarity about why that connection needed to be severed completely. The man who had tried to steal my achievements was now trying to benefit from my generosity, but both strategies reflected the same fundamental belief that he deserved access to resources he hadn't earned. 2 weeks later, the local business journal published an article about Kevin's license suspension and the ethics violations that had prompted the state board's action. The details were devastating: client complaints about misrepresented property values, accusations of pressure tactics that bordered on fraud, and evidence that he'd used client escrow accounts to cover personal expenses. The article mentioned our divorce only briefly, noting that Kevin had been unsuccessful in claiming assets from his tech entrepreneur ex-wife through litigation that had been dismissed as frivolous. But the larger story was about professional misconduct that had apparently been escalating for years while Kevin had been focused on trying to profit from my success. Reading about his downfall felt like watching the conclusion of a morality play about the consequences of dishonesty and entitlement. Kevin had destroyed his marriage, his relationship with his mistress, his professional reputation, and his financial stability through choices that reflected his fundamental character flaws. Meanwhile, the second cohort of Phoenix Rising entrepreneurs was achieving remarkable milestones that demonstrated the power of supporting people whose ambitions had been undermined by toxic relationships. A military veteran had launched a cybersecurity consulting firm despite his ex-wife's claims that he wasn't smart enough to run his own business. A recent college graduate had built a social media marketing agency while her parents insisted she should pursue traditional employment. A middle-aged woman had opened a specialty retail store despite her adult children's concerns about her risky financial decisions. Each success story reinforced the center's core mission, helping people pursue their full potential without apology or compromise. The entrepreneurs we supported weren't just building businesses, they were proving that other people's limitations didn't have to become their own, but the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. Patricia Brooks had been documenting her volunteer work at the center through a series of blog posts that had gained attention from parenting websites and family therapy professionals. Her writing about learning to support rather than control her adult daughter's choices had resonated with readers who were struggling with similar relationship dynamics. "I spent years trying to protect my daughter from what I perceived as risky decisions," she'd written in her most popular post. "I thought love meant preventing her from making mistakes or pursuing goals that seemed unrealistic. What I learned was that real love means trusting the person you've raised to make their own choices and supporting their dreams even when you don't understand them." The blog had led to speaking opportunities at parenting conferences and family therapy workshops, giving my mother a platform to share lessons about respecting adult children's autonomy and celebrating their achievements. Her transformation from someone who had undermined my success to someone who advocated for entrepreneurial independence had become its own inspiration story. The full circle felt almost too perfect to be real. The woman who had helped Kevin search for evidence of my financial deception was now helping other parents learn to support their children's business ambitions. The mother who had been threatened by my success was now celebrating other people's achievements and encouraging them to pursue their full potential. During one of our monthly dinners, Patricia had shared a conversation that captured everything beautiful about her transformation. "A woman approached me after my presentation at the family therapy conference," she'd told me. Her daughter was starting a consulting business, and she was worried about the financial risks and time commitment. She wanted to know how to convince her daughter to be more realistic about her goals. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that her daughter's success didn't depend on her mother's approval or understanding," Patricia had replied with a smile. "I explained that her job was to love and support her daughter, not to manage her choices or protect her from challenges. Most importantly, I told her that her daughter's achievements would be much more meaningful if they were accomplished with family support rather than despite family opposition." The story represented everything I'd hoped for in our relationship's reconstruction. My mother hadn't just apologized for her mistakes, she'd committed to preventing other families from experiencing the pain and division that had nearly destroyed our bond. As summer approached, the Phoenix Rising Entrepreneurship Center was preparing for its first annual conference, a 3-day event that would bring together entrepreneurs, investors, and family therapy professionals to explore the intersection of business success and personal relationships. The conference would feature panels on boundary setting, workshops on communication strategies, and networking opportunities for people who understood the unique challenges of building businesses while managing complex family dynamics. The keynote address would be delivered by a partnership. Marcus and I would present the business perspective on maintaining professional focus despite personal challenges, while my mother would speak about learning to support rather than control adult children's entrepreneurial ambitions. The collaboration felt like the perfect symbol of how completely our family's dynamics had transformed. The three people who had been involved in the original crisis, my business partner who had protected my interests, the ex-husband who had tried to destroy them, and the mother who had inadvertently helped him, would now be working together to help other families avoid similar conflicts. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of planning the conference was realizing how little Kevin's opinion or presence mattered to any of our efforts. He had become irrelevant to my success, my relationships, and my future plans. The man who had once dominated my thoughts and shaped my decisions through manipulation and emotional abuse was now just an uncomfortable memory that had catalyzed positive changes. The transformation was complete, but it was also ongoing. Every month brought new opportunities to expand the center's influence, support additional entrepreneurs, and demonstrate that success didn't require choosing between professional achievement and meaningful relationships. The key was building connections with people who celebrated rather than threatened your growth, who supported rather than undermined your ambitions. Standing in my Sedona office as the sun set over the red rocks, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that devastating morning when I'd overheard my mother's betrayal. The pain of that moment had been excruciating, but it had also been the catalyst for claiming my full power and building a life that reflected my values rather than other people's limitations. Kevin Martinez had tried to diminish me, steal from me, and destroy my reputation through legal manipulation. Instead, his attacks had provided the platform for me to demonstrate my resilience, defend my achievements, and inspire other entrepreneurs who were facing similar challenges. The game hadn't just changed, it had been completely rewritten, and in this new version, everyone who had underestimated me was discovering exactly what they had lost. The perfect circle. 5 years after the acquisition announcement that had changed everything, I stood before a packed auditorium at Arizona State University, preparing to deliver the commencement address for the business school's graduating class. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was speaking in the same building where I'd once attended lectures while working at the coffee shop, dreaming of possibilities that had seemed impossibly distant. The journey from barista to keynote speaker felt surreal, but it also represented the culmination of everything I'd learned about perseverance, authenticity, and the courage to pursue your full potential despite other people's limitations. The graduates sitting before me were about to enter a world where their success would depend not just on their business acumen, but on their ability to protect their dreams from people who might try to diminish them. Success isn't just about building profitable companies or accumulating wealth, I began, echoing words I'd spoken many times over the past few years. It's about having the courage to become who you're meant to be, even when that person doesn't match other people's expectations. In the front row, I could see Marcus beaming with pride, my mother wiping away tears, and Daniel recording the speech on his phone to share with the extended family who couldn't attend. Behind them sat 12 graduates of the Phoenix Rising Entrepreneurship Center, young entrepreneurs whose own stories of overcoming family opposition and relationship challenges had brought them to this moment of recognition. But perhaps the most meaningful presence was Victoria Sterling, who had reached out 6 months earlier to ask about participating in our program. After her relationship with Kevin had ended, she'd discovered a passion for entrepreneurship and was building a sustainable fashion company that reflected her values rather than her previous focus on material acquisition. Her transformation had been remarkable to witness. The woman who had once been interested only in Kevin's perceived financial prospects had become a thoughtful business owner committed to ethical manufacturing and environmental responsibility. Her participation in the center's program had been complicated by her history with Kevin. But her genuine commitment to personal growth had earned the respect of other entrepreneurs and demonstrated that people could change fundamental patterns of behavior when they were willing to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. The most important lesson I've learned, I continued, is that authentic success requires authentic relationships. You cannot build something meaningful while hiding who you really are or diminishing your achievements to make other people comfortable. The words carried special weight because they represented hard-won wisdom about the cost of living small to protect relationships that couldn't handle your full potential. The woman who had hidden her business empire to preserve a marriage to someone who didn't value her had learned that genuine connections could only exist when people were allowed to be completely themselves. After the ceremony, I was approached by a young woman whose story felt familiar in its details but unique in its specific challenges. Sarah Kim was graduating with honors in business administration, but her family was pressuring her to abandon her plans for starting a technology company in favor of joining her father's traditional accounting firm. They think entrepreneurship is too risky for women, she explained during our conversation at the reception. My parents immigrated here so their children could have stable careers, and they see my business plans as ungrateful rejection of their sacrifices. The dynamic was different from my own experience, but reflected the same fundamental tension between family loyalty and personal ambition that had shaped my journey. Sarah's parents weren't trying to undermine her success, they were trying to protect her from what they perceived as unnecessary risks based on their own understanding of economic security. Have you considered applying to the Phoenix Rising program? I asked, though I already suspected she would be an excellent fit for our next cohort. Actually, that's why I wanted to talk to you, she replied with a smile. I submitted my application last week, but I wanted to introduce myself in person. The encounter reminded me of why the center's work remained important despite all the recognition and expansion we'd achieved. Every graduating class contained students whose entrepreneurial ambitions were being challenged by well-meaning family members who didn't understand that support and control were fundamentally different expressions of love. Over the past 5 years, the Phoenix Rising Entrepreneurship Center had grown into a nationally recognized program with locations in 8 states and partnerships with 12 major universities. Our model of addressing the intersection between business development and personal relationships had been replicated by other organizations, creating a movement that acknowledged the unique challenges faced by entrepreneurs whose families and communities didn't understand or support their ambitions. But the most satisfying measurement of our success wasn't the program's expansion or media recognition, it was the transformation stories that emerged from every cohort of entrepreneurs we supported. The single mother who had built $1 million food service company despite her ex-husband's attempts to sabotage her efforts. The military veteran whose cybersecurity firm had been acquired by a Fortune 500 corporation after his family learned to celebrate rather than question his expertise. The recent immigrant whose consulting business had generated enough revenue to bring his extended family to the United States while proving that entrepreneurship could provide the security his parents had sought through traditional employment. Each success story reinforced the center's core mission, while adding new dimensions to our understanding of how family dynamics affected business development. The program had evolved to include specialized tracks for entrepreneurs dealing with divorce proceedings, family members who felt threatened by their success, and cultural expectations that conflicted with their professional goals. The research emerging from our work had also contributed to academic understanding of entrepreneurship and family systems. 3 peer-reviewed studies had been published based on data from our participants, demonstrating quantifiable benefits of addressing relationship challenges alongside business education. The findings had influenced curriculum development at business schools and family therapy programs, creating broader awareness of how personal and professional success were interconnected. But perhaps the most unexpected development had been my mother's emergence as a nationally recognized expert on supporting adult children's entrepreneurial ambitions. Patricia Brooks had become a sought-after speaker and consultant, helping other parents navigate the complex emotions that arose when their children pursued non-traditional career paths. Her expertise had grown from personal experience, but had been refined through years of working with Phoenix Rising participants and their families. She'd developed workshops on recognizing when parental concern crossed into control, communication strategies for discussing financial risks, and techniques for celebrating achievements that parents didn't fully understand. The hardest part, she'd explained in a recent interview with Entrepreneur magazine, is learning that your child's success doesn't depend on your approval or understanding. Your job is to love and support them, not to manage their choices or protect them from challenges that will help them grow. The quote had become one of the most shared pieces of content from our center's social media presence, resonating with parents and adult children who were struggling with similar relationship dynamics. My mother had transformed her biggest mistake into her greatest contribution, using her experience of almost losing her daughter to help other families avoid similar crises. The annual Phoenix Rising Conference had become one of the Southwest's premier entrepreneurship events, attracting participants from across the country who were interested in the intersection of business success and personal relationships. This year's conference had featured panel discussions on boundary setting, workshops on communication strategies, and networking opportunities for entrepreneurs whose families had learned to support rather than undermine their ambitions. The closing ceremony had included a surprise announcement that still felt surreal weeks later. The Phoenix Rising Entrepreneurship Center had been selected to receive a $5 million grant from a national foundation focused on supporting innovative approaches to business education. The funding would enable expansion into 12 additional states and the development of online programming that could reach entrepreneurs worldwide. The recognition felt like validation of everything we'd built, but it also represented new responsibilities and opportunities to impact even more lives. The Foundation Selection Committee had been particularly impressed by our family therapy component and the documented outcomes showing improved relationships alongside business success. As I sat in my Sedona office reviewing plans for the program expansion, I found myself thinking about Kevin and wondering whether he'd followed any of the news about the center's growth and recognition. His real estate license had never been reinstated, and he'd eventually moved to Nevada to pursue what Daniel described as a series of increasingly questionable business ventures. The last reliable information about Kevin's circumstances had come through Victoria, who had mentioned during a group session that he'd contacted her several months earlier, asking for money to invest in a cryptocurrency trading scheme. She'd declined, having learned to recognize manipulative behavior and prioritize her own financial security over other people's poor decisions. His continued pursuit of get-rich quick schemes, rather than legitimate business development, suggested that Kevin had never learned the fundamental lessons about character and competence that his downfall should have taught him. But his choices were no longer my concern or responsibility, they were simply reminders of what happened when people refused to take accountability for their behavior and its consequences. The contrast between Kevin's trajectory and the success stories emerging from our program felt like perfect illustration of how different approaches to challenge and setback could lead to completely different outcomes. The entrepreneurs we supported faced obstacles and relationship conflicts, but they responded by building stronger boundaries, developing better communication skills, and creating businesses that reflected their values rather than compromising their integrity for short-term advantages. Meanwhile, Marcus had been developing plans for his own venture, a technology company focused on artificial intelligence applications for supply chain optimization. His experience with TechFlow and the Phoenix Rising Center had given him insights into market opportunities that larger corporations were overlooking, and he was excited about building something new from the ground up. The difference this time, he'd explained during our most recent planning session, is that I know exactly who I am and what I'm trying to accomplish. There's no hiding, no compartmentalization, no managing other people's insecurities about my success. The observation captured something important about how both of us had changed since our TechFlow days. We'd learned to lead with authenticity, rather than accommodation, to build relationships that could handle our full selves, rather than diminished versions, designed to make other people comfortable. This approach had proven successful, in both business and personal contexts. The entrepreneurs in our program built stronger companies when they stopped trying to manage other people's reactions to their ambitions. The families who learned to support rather than control their members developed closer relationships based on mutual respect rather than emotional manipulation. As the sun set over the red rocks surrounding my office, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed since that devastating morning when I discovered my mother's betrayal. The pain of that moment had been excruciating, but it had also been the catalyst for every positive change that had followed. The woman who had hidden her success to protect a marriage that couldn't handle her achievements had become someone who helped other entrepreneurs avoid similar compromises. The daughter who had been betrayed by her mother's loyalty to a manipulative ex-husband had rebuilt their relationship on foundations of mutual respect and authentic communication. Most importantly, the barista who had dreamed of building something meaningful while serving coffee to customers who dismissed her potential had created a business empire that provided opportunities for hundreds of other entrepreneurs to pursue their own extraordinary dreams. Kevin Martinez had tried to diminish me, steal from me, and destroy my reputation through legal manipulation and family politics. Instead, his attacks had provided the catalyst for me to claim my full power and build a life that exceeded every limitation other people had tried to place on my potential. The game hadn't just changed, it had been completely rewritten. And in this new version, everyone who had underestimated me was discovering exactly what they had lost while watching me build something extraordinary from the ashes of their betrayal.
Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but they would be met by someone who no longer apologized for her success or diminished her achievements to accommodate other people's insecurities. Natalie Brooks, entrepreneur and architect of her own destiny, was ready for whatever came next. The perfect circle was complete, but it was also just the beginning. The morning Kevin called sobbing was exactly 7 years after I'd first overheard my mother plotting against me in her kitchen. I was in my corner office at the Phoenix Rising headquarters in downtown Phoenix, reviewing acquisition proposals from 3 different venture capital firms who wanted to purchase our rapidly expanding network of entrepreneurship centers. The irony of the timing wasn't lost on me as I watched his name appear on my phone screen, interrupting a meeting about our company's valuation that had reached 8 figures. "Natalie, please, I'm begging you." Kevin's voice was barely recognizable through his tears. "I need to talk to your mother. She won't take my calls anymore, and I don't know what else to do." The desperation in his tone was absolute and pathetic. This was the same man who had once dismissed my intelligence, cheated on our marriage, and tried to steal my business assets through fraudulent legal claims. Now he was calling the woman he'd betrayed to beg for access to the mother who had once helped him spy on me.
Kevin, my mother doesn't owe you anything. Neither do I. Your current situation is the direct result of choices you made, starting with how you treated me during our marriage and continuing through every unethical decision you've made since our divorce. I know I made mistakes, he said, his sobs becoming more intense. But I didn't deserve this. I lost my license, my apartment, my girlfriend, everything. All because I tried to get what I thought was fair from our divorce. The self-pity and refusal to take responsibility were exactly what I'd expected from Kevin, but hearing them articulated so clearly still managed to disgust me. Even facing homelessness and complete professional ruin, he couldn't acknowledge that his problems stemmed from fundamental character flaws rather than external injustices. "You didn't lose everything because you tried to get a fair settlement," I corrected him. "You lost everything because you lied to clients, mismanaged their funds, harassed your ex-girlfriend when she ended your relationship, and built your entire adult life on manipulation and dishonesty. The state licensing board didn't revoke your credentials because of our divorce. They revoked them because you're incompetent and unethical. Please just ask your mother to call me back," Kevin begged, apparently unable to process anything beyond his immediate needs. "She used to care about me. She defended me when you were being unreasonable about our marriage problems." The reference to Patricia's previous support for Kevin demonstrated how completely he'd misunderstood the dynamics of what had happened between us. My mother hadn't defended him because she'd believed in his character. She'd defended him because his story had fit her preconceptions about marriage and family loyalty. Once she'd learned the truth about his behavior and seen the evidence of my success, her opinion had shifted decisively. "My mother doesn't care about you anymore, Kevin," I said bluntly. "She's seen who you really are, and she's chosen to support her daughter instead of the man who tried to manipulate our family against me. She's not going to help you find work, give you money, or provide references to potential employers. But she's connected to successful people now because of your business." Kevin pressed, apparently believing that my achievements had somehow made my mother responsible for his welfare. "She could introduce me to entrepreneurs who might need sales help. I'm good at sales when I'm given a real chance." The delusion was remarkable. Kevin was asking my mother to leverage relationships she'd built through my success to help the man who had tried to steal from me, lied about me, and caused our family tremendous pain. He seemed to believe that my business empire existed primarily to provide opportunities for him rather than representing my own independent achievements. "Kevin, you're not good at sales. You're good at manipulation and deception, which worked temporarily in real estate because clients trusted you initially. But those tactics don't create sustainable business relationships, which is why your career imploded as soon as people figured out what kind of person you were dealing with." The silence that followed was broken only by his continued sobbing, a sound that might have generated sympathy if it weren't coming from someone who had shown no remorse for the pain he'd caused others. Kevin was crying because his life had collapsed, not because he'd hurt people or learned from his mistakes. "I have nowhere else to turn," he finally whispered. "Everyone else has given up on me. Your mother was the only person who ever believed I could be better than I was." "My mother believed in a version of you that never existed," I replied. "She thought you were a hard-working man struggling against difficult circumstances. When she learned that you were actually a cheating, lying manipulator who tried to steal from her daughter, she stopped believing in you." "That's not abandonment, Kevin. That's accurate assessment of your character." The conversation was interrupted by my assistant's gentle knock on the office door, reminding me that 3 of Arizona's most prominent investors were waiting to discuss purchasing our company for a sum that would transform the Phoenix Rising model into a national franchise operation. I was about to conclude the most important business negotiation of my career, and Kevin Martinez was trying to insert himself into my success story as if he deserved consideration or assistance. "I have to go, Kevin," I said, preparing to end the call. "I'm in the middle of a business meeting that's worth more money than you'll see in your lifetime." "Wait, please," he said desperately. "Just tell me one thing. Do you ever think about what could have been different? If I'd been more supportive of your business, if I'd appreciated what you were building instead of feeling threatened by it?" The question was interesting because it suggested some level of self-awareness about his mistakes, but it also revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of what had gone wrong between us. Kevin was imagining that minor adjustments to his behavior could have saved our marriage and given him access to my success, rather than recognizing that his character flaws had made any genuine partnership impossible. "Kevin, if you'd been the kind of person who could appreciate and support my success, you wouldn't have been cheating on me with your assistant," I replied. "The problems in our marriage weren't about your attitude toward my business, they were about who you are as a person. You can't separate your inability to handle my achievements from your willingness to lie, cheat, and manipulate people." "I could change," he said, though his voice carried no conviction. "If I had another chance, I could be different." "You've had 7 years of chances to change, and you've gotten progressively worse," I pointed out. "You went from cheating husband to fraudulent lawsuit filer to client fund embezzler to stalker. That's not someone who's learning from their mistakes, Kevin. That's someone whose character flaws are becoming more pronounced under pressure." I ended the call without waiting for his response, and walked into the conference room where Marcus and I would spend the next 3 hours negotiating the sale that would take Phoenix Rising from a regional success story to a national franchise operation. The investors were particularly interested in our family therapy component and the documented outcomes showing improved relationships alongside business success. By the end of the meeting, we'd agreed to a preliminary offer that valued our company at $12 million, with provisions for additional payments based on expansion milestones over the following 5 years. The deal would provide resources to open locations in 25 states, while maintaining the quality and personalization that had made our program effective. As the investors left our office, Marcus turned to me with a grin that captured everything extraordinary about our journey together. "Do you realize what just happened?" he asked. "We started TechFlow in your spare bedroom while you were hiding from your cheating husband, and now we've built something that's going to help entrepreneurs across the entire country." The progression felt surreal but also inevitable, the natural result of consistently choosing growth over comfort, authenticity over accommodation, and meaningful work over easy money. Every challenge we'd faced had become fuel for building something larger and more impactful than what we'd originally envisioned. That evening, I drove to my mother's house in Tempe to share the news about the acquisition offer. Patricia had become one of my closest advisors over the past few years, and her perspective on business decisions was valuable partly because it wasn't influenced by profit motives or industry trends. She helped me think about the human impact of our choices and the legacy we wanted to create through our work. I found her in her garden, tending to the tomato plants that had become her passion project during retirement. The sight of my mother working with her hands reminded me of everything that had healed between us since the dark period when she'd helped Kevin spy on me. The woman who had once been threatened by my success was now one of my strongest supporters, someone who celebrated my achievements without needing to understand every detail of how I'd accomplished them. "How did the meeting go with the investors?" she asked, settling into the patio chair beside me with 2 glasses of iced tea. "They offered $12 million for the company," I said, still processing the magnitude of the number, "with performance bonuses that could bring the total to $20 million over 5 years. Patricia was quiet for a moment, absorbing information that represented wealth beyond anything our family had ever imagined possible. "And how do you feel about selling something you've worked so hard to build?" The question went to the heart of my ambivalence about the acquisition offer. Phoenix Rising had become more than just a business. It was my identity as an entrepreneur, and proof that people could transform painful experiences into meaningful contributions. Selling the company would provide resources for expansion, but it would also mean giving up direct control over the mission that had emerged from my own journey. "I think it's the right decision," I said slowly. "Marcus and I have proven that the model works, but we don't have the infrastructure to scale it nationally without help. The investors understand our mission, and they're committed to maintaining the quality standards that make our program effective. And Kevin called you today, my mother said, her tone shifting to something more serious. I wasn't surprised that she knew about the conversation. Kevin had probably tried calling her before reaching out to me, and she'd likely seen his number on her missed call list. He's homeless and desperate, asking me to convince you to help him find work. I got 6 voicemails from him yesterday. Patricia confirmed. Each one more pathetic than the last. He seems to think that because you're successful, I should feel obligated to rescue him from the consequences of his own behavior. The dynamic was both familiar and infuriating. Kevin had spent years trying to claim ownership of my achievements, and now he was attempting to leverage my success into assistance from the woman who had once supported him against me. His assumption that my mother's loyalty was transferable rather than earned revealed how little he understood about authentic relationships. What are you going to do? I asked. Nothing, Patricia replied firmly. Kevin Martinez is not my responsibility, and his problems are not my concern. He made his choices, and he can live with the consequences. The certainty in her voice represented a complete transformation from the woman who had once believed that family loyalty required supporting Kevin against her own daughter. Patricia had learned to distinguish between appropriate concern and enabling behavior, between helping people and rescuing them from problems they'd created themselves. I'm proud of you for setting those boundaries, I said. 7 years ago, you would have felt guilty about not helping him. 7 years ago, I didn't understand the difference between love and control, she replied. I thought caring about someone meant managing their choices and protecting them from consequences. Kevin taught me that some people will exploit your kindness until you learn to protect yourself from their manipulation. The conversation continued as the sun set over the desert landscape that had become the backdrop for my extraordinary transformation. My mother and I talked about the acquisition offer, the expansion plans for Phoenix Rising, and the speaking opportunities that continued to emerge from my reputation as an expert on entrepreneurship and personal relationships. But we also discussed Kevin's call and what it represented about people who refused to take responsibility for their choices. His continued attempts to access my success through manipulation and guilt demonstrated that some individuals never learned from their mistakes, never developed the character required for authentic relationships or sustainable achievement. Do you ever feel sorry for him? Patricia asked as we prepared to go inside. I feel sorry for anyone whose life is diminished by their own poor choices, I replied honestly. But I don't feel responsible for fixing problems that Kevin created through dishonesty and entitlement. He had opportunities to be different, to make better decisions, to learn from his mistakes. He chose not to take them. 2 weeks later, the acquisition paperwork was finalized, and Phoenix Rising Entrepreneurship Centers officially became part of a national franchise operation with the resources to expand into markets we'd never been able to reach independently. The announcement generated significant media attention, with business publications highlighting our unique approach to addressing personal relationships alongside business development. The coverage included interviews with program graduates who shared stories about overcoming family opposition, divorce proceedings, and social expectations that had initially seemed incompatible with their entrepreneurial ambitions. Each testimonial reinforced the importance of work that might have seemed peripheral to traditional business education, but had proven essential for sustainable success. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Arizona State University announced the creation of the Natalie Brooks Institute for Entrepreneurial Independence, a research center focused on studying the intersection of business success and personal relationships. The institute would be housed in the business school building where I'd once attended lectures while working at the coffee shop, dreaming of possibilities that had seemed impossibly distant. The announcement ceremony was held in the same auditorium where I'd delivered the commencement address 2 years earlier, bringing my journey full circle in a way that felt both surreal and inevitable. Standing at the podium where my professors had once taught me about strategic planning and market analysis, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed since those early days of hidden ambition and secret success. The greatest lesson I've learned, I told the audience of students, faculty, and business leaders, is that you cannot build something meaningful while pretending to be someone smaller than you really are. Authentic success requires authentic relationships, and authentic relationships can only exist when people are allowed to be completely themselves. In the audience I could see Marcus beaming with pride, my mother wiping away tears, and 12 graduates of our program who had gone on to build successful businesses while maintaining healthy family relationships. But perhaps the most satisfying presence was the absence of anyone who had tried to diminish my achievements or claim ownership of my success. Kevin Martinez was not there to witness my recognition, not because he hadn't been invited, but because his life had become so diminished by his own choices that he was no longer relevant to my story. The man who had once dominated my thoughts and decisions through manipulation and emotional abuse had become just an uncomfortable memory that had catalyzed positive changes. After the ceremony, I was approached by Sarah Kim, the young entrepreneur I'd met at the graduation ceremony 5 years earlier. She was now running a successful technology consultancy that specialized in helping traditional businesses adapt to digital marketplaces, and her parents had become two of her strongest supporters after seeing the positive impact of her work. "I wanted to thank you for encouraging me to apply to Phoenix Rising," she said during our conversation at the reception. "The program didn't just help me build my business, it helped me understand how to maintain relationships with people who love me but don't always understand my choices." The story was exactly what the Institute was designed to study and replicate. Sarah had learned to pursue her entrepreneurial ambitions without sacrificing family connections, creating success that strengthened rather than strained her most important relationships. Her parents had learned to support rather than control their daughter's choices, transforming concern into celebration. "What's next for you?" I asked, genuinely curious about her plans. "I'm launching a nonprofit that provides technology consulting services to other family-owned businesses," she replied. "Specifically companies where generational differences about digital adoption are creating conflict between parents and adult children who want to modernize operations." The initiative was brilliant because it addressed the same relationship dynamics that Phoenix Rising had been studying, but in a different context. Sarah was using her expertise to help families work together rather than against each other, transforming potential conflicts into collaborative opportunities. As the evening concluded and I prepared to leave the university campus, I found myself thinking about all the people whose lives had been touched by the programs we'd created. Hundreds of entrepreneurs had built successful businesses while maintaining healthy relationships. Dozens of families had learned to support rather than undermine their members' ambitions. Countless individuals had discovered that they didn't have to choose between personal success and meaningful connections. But perhaps the most important impact had been on my own understanding of what success really meant. The woman who had once hidden her achievements to protect relationships that couldn't handle her potential had learned that authentic success was impossible without authentic relationships. The key was finding people who celebrated rather than threatened your growth, who supported rather than controlled your choices. The drive home through Phoenix took me past neighborhoods where I'd lived my hidden double life, thinking about how different everything looked now that the truth was finally exposed. The modest house where Kevin and I had shared our failing marriage was now occupied by a young family who probably had no idea about the drama that had unfolded within those walls. But more importantly, the desert landscape that had once felt limiting now seemed full of possibility. Arizona had become the headquarters for a national movement that was changing how entrepreneurs thought about success and relationships. The woman who had served coffee while studying business principles had become someone whose ideas were influencing industry practices and academic research. As I pulled into the driveway of my Scottsdale home, a property that reflected my current reality rather than my previous limitations, I felt a profound sense of completion. The journey from betrayed wife to nationally recognized entrepreneur had been painful, challenging, and ultimately transformative in ways that exceeded every dream I'd ever allowed myself to imagine. Kevin Martinez had tried to diminish me, steal from me, and destroy my reputation through legal manipulation and family politics. Instead, his attacks had provided the catalyst for me to claim my full power and build a life that exceeded every limitation other people had tried to place on my potential. The game hadn't just changed, it had been completely rewritten. And in this new version, everyone who had underestimated me was discovering exactly what they had lost while watching me build something extraordinary from the ashes of their betrayal. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but they would be met by someone who no longer apologized for her success or diminished her achievements to accommodate other people's insecurities. The perfect circle was complete, but it was also just the beginning of whatever extraordinary things came next. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.